Okay, we're live, everybody.
Mm.
Alexander, let's start with Alexander. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. I had a restful Sunday in the middle of all of this crisis. One needs it sometimes. And I myself again fully recharged and able to follow the news, and very happy again to be on this program. And a delight also to have Gonzalo with us again.
All right, let's. We're having a little bit of connection problems with Gonzalo, but let's see. Gonzalo, how are you?
Oh.
He's on mute. Gonzalo, can you hear us? Okay. I don't think he can hear us. We can see your photo there.
We can see his photo.
And you're on mute if you hear us, but all right. Okay. He's dropped off. Yeah, we were having. Okay. That's why we're a little late, everybody, because we're having some connection problems. Anyway, Gonzalo will jump on when
I'm sure he will. Yeah,
sorted out. Let's see. Where do we begin? Alexander. First, okay, I lost my train of thought. Everybody, welcome everybody from Rumble, from Odyssey, from our great community at Locals, everyone in the YT chat, and to our awesome moderators. I caught a glimpse of Valley S there, and who else is in the house? And who else? I think it's just you, Valley S, moderating. All right. GEC 812 is also with us. Great. Awesome.
Gonzalo says everything is fixed.
So okay. Let's bring Gonzalo in then. Hello, Gonzalo.
Hello, gentlemen. Sorry about those technical difficulties.
All good. We hear you.
Perfect. We hear you perfect. Excellent. Yeah.
How are you? How are you? First question. As I asked Alexander, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I've said before, and I might be repeating myself, but being in a war zone is simultaneously the most boring experience in the world and the most terrifying, because you're constantly stressed, and but there's nothing to do, so you're just waiting around and consuming news, and you're just stressed but bored. That's war for you. What can I say?
Okay, let's just get right into it. To both of you, Alexander and Gonzalo. Before we get into this stream, will be more on the economic side of things. By the way, Gonzalo, I put a link for everyone watching to Gonzalo Lira's channel on YouTube. There's a link in the description box down below. I'll post it in the chat as well in a bit as well. And Gonzalo did a really good stream on the economic sanctions and the financial situation. So we're going to pick up a lot of, we'll pick up from that stream, Gonzalo, that you did the other day on that. But first, let's get into what you guys think is going on the ground. How do you see things going on with the conflict in Ukraine? Let's tackle that real quick, and then let's move on to the main topic, which is the sanctions, the economic fallout, the systems collapse that we are seeing. Price spikes in just about everything. Biden going to Iran, to Venezuela. Anyway, to both of you, Alexander, Gonzalo, whoever wants to go first, how do you guys see things this Monday?
I defer to my kind host. Yes.
Well, I'll be very brief. I mean, as far as I can see, it's exactly what we've been talking about in our previous programs. The Russians are continuing to pursue the Syrian strategy. They're trying to negotiate the opening of those humanitarian corridors to the big cities. They want the civilians to leave, but I suspect also ultimately they want the people, the Azov people, all of those people to put down their arms and to leave. Now, as I understand it, and of course it's incredibly difficult now to get information because we have to work through very difficult restrictions on news sources, the kind of news sources that provide in some ways useful pictures. But from what I've been able to understand, the Ukrainian force in eastern Ukraine is now surrounded. I mean, and there's been advances in Mariupol where the situation is apparently absolutely calamitous. But anyway, there's still fighting going on in and around there. But in the other big places, we now have a kind of very precarious silence as there's this attempt to set up the humanitarian corridors. Now, both sides are accusing the other of violating agreements in relation to those humanitarian corridors. Same thing happened again in Syria, by the way. This wasn't an easy thing to sort out at all. In both cases, both in Syria and in Ukraine, the Russians are trying to work with the UN agencies to try to facilitate the work of these corridors. We'll see whether or not it happens. But the other big news is, firstly, we're going to have more negotiations in Belarus. The Russians, as far as I can see, are being implacable. And of course, we had that meeting between Putin and the cabin crews of Russian airlines. I didn't see it, to say it clearly. I mean, because this is impossible to get the whole picture of exactly what Putin said. But from what I gathered, he was basically saying that unless Ukraine comes to terms quickly, then Ukrainian statehood will be put in question. That may not be an entirely accurate description of exactly what he said, but from what I understand, that is what he said. And that suggests to me that this is the last real opportunity for the Ukrainians to settle this issue and to come to terms in a way that the Russians would find acceptable. And if they don't, the Russians will escalate the situation militarily. One very last thing. I understand that Lavrov and Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, are meeting in Turkey. Erdogan has been trying to arrange a meeting between Putin and Zelensky in Turkey for months. It's clear Putin isn't interested in that, but Lavrov is meeting Kuleba there. It's apparently, well, we'll see what comes of that meeting too, but it's at least high-level contacts, and it suggests that someone in Ukraine perhaps is coming to realize that the 7th Cavalry isn't going to ride across the horizon to Ukraine's rescue, and they're faced with no realistic option but to come to terms. I'm going to add one very last thing, and this is my own view, which is that to the extent that there is a Ukrainian military strategy now, it is to try to do something which will provoke Western military intervention. Now, that may be unfair, but that's how it looks to me. Not happening. I mean, the West won't intervene militarily. That is simply not going to happen.
Oh, they're pouring in a lot of weapons. That's for sure. Gonzalo, your take.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Well, the word I'm getting here, I'm obsessing about Twitter, and the word I'm getting. Do you hear me properly, gentlemen?
Yes.
Okay, great. The word that's coming down right now from the negotiations that have started barely an hour and a half ago, but the word is that, and this is from Dmitry Peskov, Russia has told Ukraine that it could halt the operation at any moment if Kiev meets Russian conditions. Second point, Ukraine must recognize Crimea as Russian, as well as the independence of the DNR and the LNR. And the third point is that Ukraine must amend the constitution and renounce its claim to join, quote, any bloc, end quote. Now, that's the word that just came out from Dmitry Peskov, and rumors of roughly that negotiating position had been coming out earlier. Now, that seems to be a very soft negotiating position on the part of the Russians. And the Zelensky negotiators rejected that, specifically the third point of Ukraine not joining any bloc and putting it in its constitution that it would remain neutral. I think that the Russian negotiators went very soft but hard on that single point. And I think that they already knew the answer, and that's why they went so soft, so that later they could say, oh, well, we tried as best we could. But the Zelensky regime refused to budge on this key issue that we have of Ukrainian neutrality. Because the Russians, obviously, they want a permanent neutrality for Ukraine at this point. They're not going to accept, Ukraine will not join NATO for the next 5 or 10 years. No, they want something, permanent. And it's understandable. I mean, once you've committed, to an operation like this, you want a permanent settlement, not something that you're going to have to revisit in 5-10 years. Now, my thinking, I hear on the ground, you're not experiencing anything, okay? But I have to say, and I'll just state it, I think that a lot of the shelling and a lot of the so-called shelling of civilians and attack on civilians by the Russians, I think that either the Zelensky regime put weapons in the middle of civilians, or and I know how insane this might sound, but it has to be said by somebody. I do believe that the Ukrainian armed forces might be attacking their own people for the public relations benefit, because some of these attacks just do not make any sense at all, because there's nothing around. There's no reason for anybody to be shelling this, and it's certainly not for the benefit of the Russians. But it's quite obvious that the Zelensky regime benefits on a PR level from civilian casualties.
Yes.
And so I'm sorry, but I just don't buy it. I don't believe that the Russians are doing this. I mean, I know for a fact that the Russians are not killing babies and unplugging them from incubators, as the typical propaganda ramps up in every war. But I have to say, I just don't believe it. It just doesn't pass the smell test. And I know that a lot of Ukrainians are going to be very upset with me when I say this, but that's my suspicion. And I started suspecting it early on with this nonsense of the ghost of Kiev, the fighter ace who blew a dozen aircraft out of the sky in the first 10 minutes of the war. And then the clear provocation of saboteurs at the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, and a lot of other lies that the Zelensky regime has been floating out there. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. It doesn't make any rational sense for the Russians to be harming civilians. And if the chat is really upset with me about it, I'm sorry, but somebody has to say it.
Yeah. Well, all I will say about this, and I obviously not on the ground, but obviously I come back to my original point that the Ukrainians' strategy, to the extent that they have one, it seems to me, is to do something that will provoke Western intervention, because otherwise the outcome is exactly like Syria. It was exactly the same in Syria.
Like Syria.
It was exactly the same in Syria. Exactly. It's the only real card they have to play in military terms, and of course they're playing it for all it's worth. I will say, and I will say this again, this has been, and this isn't just my view, this is I've spoken to military people, this is, as a war, a exceptionally soft war. This isn't a war this isn't the kind of war that we have been accustomed to fighting in the West. One of the reasons we find it so difficult to understand, by the way, because our usual practice is to go on. If you remember the very first day of the Iraq war, we bombed Saddam Hussein's headquarters. We tried to kill him. We were doing the same thing, by the way, in the Libyan war. It's not widely known, but during the actual intervention, there were multiple attempts to kill Gaddafi. There was attacks on his headquarters. They were clearly trying to track him down and to kill him. And of course, there were attacks on civilian infrastructure, all those sorts of things. And the other thing about Western style of war is that it tends to be conducted from the air. And it's extremely unusual to actually send in troops, tanks, all that kind of thing before a bombing campaign has done, really significant damage to the other side. If you remember, in 1991, during the first war against Iraq, the US bombed Iraq for 2 months before launching a ground offensive. So we don't really understand this war because it's so completely different from the way that we conduct war ourselves. That you get the sense that there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty about how it's working out.
I've got another question for you guys before we get into the economic stuff. But just going off of what you said, Alexander, it's very much the way they're handling the sanctions against Russia right now. It is a shock and awe against Russia, and that is, that's the modus operandi, which is, you really go at a country, and it's just shock and awe. You level it to the ground, you throw everything you have at it, and then you try to accomplish your goals after you've completely decimated it. So if you look at how the West went about Iraq and how they went about Libya and how they tried to go about Syria, and I'll get into that in a bit. But and then you look at how they're going after Russia with the sanctions. It's the same freaking thing. You throw everything you have at it, you completely decapitate your opponent, and then you go in to achieve whatever goal that is, whether it's regime change or breaking it apart, balkanizing it, whatever it is. You know, I've seen the buildings in downtown Belgrade. And I saw them recently that were attacked in the middle of Belgrade downtown. And those were being attacked by the air for 80 some odd nights. And I mean, they're still there. You can still see the destruction. It is still there. And the Serbian people have kept it there as a reminder to show everybody that that they were targeting the center of a highly populated capital in Europe. And so my question to, and going off of Syria, by the way, Alexander, remember, every time Assad was winning, every time he was winning decisively in Syria, there was some sort of false flag. And Nikki Haley would hold up some photos, and then Ivanka Trump would go to her father and say, oh my God, look what they're doing to the children. And everyone would ask the same logical question. Why in God's name would Assad do such a stupid thing when he was winning the war decisively? And, you know, they were trying to manufacture consent. So both of you can comment on that. And then my final question before we get to the economics of things, the financial side of all of this, is I think you both have different points or different ideas as to how far Russia wants to take this. And I believe, Gonzalo, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you feel that Russia may go further west than what Alexander believes. Maybe I'm wrong there, but what are your thoughts there? Because that's a question mark that everyone has.
I mean, I'd be very interested to hear your views on this, Gonzalo, actually, because I don't know how far west Russia is indeed going to go.
Just to finish off the point of attacking civilians, the Russians are setting up humanitarian corridors in all the cities. And they are encouraging civilians to go. And also, not so subtly, they are encouraging soldiers to take off their uniform and slip away with the civilians. And they're making no bones about it. They want, obviously, they want soldiers to put down their weapons and slink away. And that's a perfectly respectable strategy. But you see, why would you open humanitarian corridors and then start shelling civilians? That doesn't make sense. You know, scare the civilians so much that they refuse to go down the humanitarian corridors that you have set up specifically to drain the cities of civilians. It doesn't make any sense. And so it's sort of like the Syrian situation. Now, to go back to the end stage of this operation, it seems clear to me that the Russians mean to take the entire country. And what's clear is that the east is the most problematic part because it's where the Ukrainian army is. And now that it seems, although I have not seen the hard evidence, but it seems that they have encircled the Ukrainian army. And quite frankly, if they hadn't encircled the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian army had somehow slipped away or was holding its ground, we would have heard about it from the Ukrainian side. They would have, touted it as a great victory, if only a moral victory of fending off capture. The fact that they're not talking about it leads me to conclude that the Russians have successfully encircled them, and now it's just a matter of time. They're just turning up the heat on the cauldron, and that's that. Well, the east was the most problematic, the hardest part for the Ukrainian army. The center, it seems to be falling in line. And my thinking is that once the east and the center are consolidated, and do keep in mind the last couple of days, it seems that the Russian armed forces have consolidated and regrouped for another hard offensive over the next few days. Well, it would seem that once the east and the center of the country are firmly in hand, I think that their objective would be to simply have two armies dash to the west towards Lviv, and one flank on the north and one from the south to reach up to Lviv and encircle Lviv and capture the whole country. I mean, I don't see much of a reason why you would leave the West alone. I mean, you want to hold the whole country, and especially because there is no hard natural border between Poland and Hungary and Ukraine. So you'd want to have control, you yourself, the Russians would want to have control of that border. And so it seems to me that they're going to go for the whole country. And that's going to take time, because it takes time to cover such a large country. But if you say, 3 weeks to 5 weeks, that's achievable. And I think that that's their ultimate goal. And I think, frankly, I think that all of these negotiations are kind of like a waste of time, because I think that the Russians have no real intention of negotiating with the Zelensky regime. I think that they mean to get rid of them one way or the other. And what's interesting is that the Americans are already laying the groundwork for a Zelensky government in exile, or to create a new government in exile, assuming that Zelensky himself is killed or captured by the Russians.
On the diplomacy, I completely agree with you. I should say, Gonzalo, that I think, in my opinion, the reason these negotiations are taking place is partly because the Russians do want to keep, as I said, this government going until they're in a position to replace it with something different. They want to keep the local governments operating. They want the bureaucracy to continue to function. All the things that I've discussed in previous programs. They don't want uncontrolled chaos across Ukraine, because once that gets going, then, as we saw in Iraq, it's a nightmare to stop. So that's one reason. But the other reason, almost certainly, is they want to provide diplomatic cover to their allies. So the Chinese, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Brazilians, the Mexicans, to some extent even the Turks, they find this a difficult conflict because, of course, all of them are, at least in theory, very strong on preserving territorial integrity. I mean, that's part of what they do. So the Russians have to appear reasonable at all times. They have to be prepared to appear like they're negotiating at all times in order to give their friends in Beijing, in Delhi, in Islamabad, in Brasilia, in wherever, so as to give them diplomatic cover so that they can all say, well, look, the Russians were being completely reasonable. What they were asking for was not excessive or unreasonable. It was the Ukrainians ultimately that just wouldn't accept and wouldn't recognize the realities, and who were egged on to do it by the West. And if you go to the Chinese media in particular, that is exactly the point that they're making, that they support these negotiations, and that the reason the negotiations aren't succeeding is because the Western powers are obstructing them. So that's I think, the purpose of the negotiations. Now, as to your first point about Lviv and all this, I'm going to say straight away, I defer to your knowledge of the country and the place. As I said, I'm not a military person at all.
Oh, neither am I.
Limited understanding of these things. And of course, I've never been to Ukraine. I don't know the geography of the country or the layout of the country very well either. But I'm absolutely
I believe, Alexander,
I
believe that the position that they're going to knock all the way to Lviv is also a position that has been taken by McGregor and I believe Scott Ritter as well. So
absolutely.
there are two. Obviously, there are two ways to look at it, and Gonzalo's point is excellent as to why they're going to go all the way. But I believe there's also the argument as to why they're not. So I mean,
my own view was that that they would be using that area as a kind of sanctuary area, a sort of place where they would send all these people who are leaving these cities, that they would be decanted to Lviv. But maybe I'm being a bit too mechanical and taking the
no, not at all. I think that I think that a lot of them are fleeing to Poland. Because I mean, if you think about it, what Russia would like to do is essentially drain the country of anybody who would realistically oppose them, and the people who would realistically oppose them, people who are more Western oriented. By this time, a lot of them, if not most of them, have already crossed the border into Poland. I understand that we are closing in on 2 million refugees entering Europe. That's the last figure I've heard. Is that accurate?
I believe it is. And on that, by the way, I have an anecdotal thing to say, which is that a friend of mine, a British friend of mine who lives in Germany, who's a a completely apolitical person, I want to stress, but he was on the night bus from Dresden to Berlin, and the place, it was full of Ukrainians, and there's Ukrainian refugees now pouring into the country. And he said to me something which I found extremely interesting, which is that they are disproportionately young men. And I suspect that what they're doing is avoiding conscription. So I mean, I'm this is just obviously anecdotal, but he's a person I would place very high reliance upon what he said.
Same thing we saw in Syria, by the way. You guys want to move on to some of the financial stuff?
Let's go.
I think there's a lot of stuff going on.
Oh yeah, that's interesting stuff today.
That's the interesting stuff. All right, Gonzalo, what you did a really good you did a good stream yesterday on the sanctions, and now we have word that the Biden White House is running to they're looking to tie up the JCPOA, and they've sent officials to Venezuela. Obviously, they're trying to find a way to cover the loss of Russian energy and Russian oil. How do you see things going, Gonzalo?
Well, this is a catastrophe for the Western economies. It's simple as that. And I think that they're virtue signaling because so much of it is, the Russians bad and everything Russian is bad. And we have to just show those Russians that we are going to sanction them to death. Well, they dropped the thermonuclear option on the Russian economy. And the Russian economy long-term is going to wind up much better positioned than the European or American economy. And to tell you the truth, I think that this might spell the death knell of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Now, you have to keep in mind something for your audience. Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, which as a practical matter are currently now in the control of the Kremlin. Whether you like it or not, that's the reality of the situation at this time. Well, those three countries control, let me see now, 50% of Europe's food, 40% of Europe's energy needs, 25% of the, actually I have the figures right here, I forgot. Let me just access them. Yes, 25 to 30% of global exports of wheat, 25% of global exports of barley. And here's something crucial that people don't seem to notice, because we're coming up on springtime. Springtime is when you need to start planting things. The Russians control. These three countries account for 35% of global potash and 15% of global urea. Both of them are fertilizers essential for global agriculture. And so the Kremlin is in the driver's seat insofar as hard commodities, especially agro commodities. And of course, if agricultural products go up, if energy prices go up, what does that mean for the dollar? What does that mean for the euro? And here is a kicker, a hard kicker, right to the teeth, that any country that sanctions Russia, the Kremlin declared yesterday, they must settle their accounts with Russia in rubles. Now, this is devastating, because what will happen is that a lot of these countries, they've imposed all these sanctions, but they've exempted agro imports and energy imports. And so if the Russians are saying, we're not going to give you any more, because, you sanctioned us, so we're not going to give you any more agro commodities or energy commodities unless you pay us in rubles, then it's going to drive up the price of the ruble. The foreigners, the EU, the United States, all these countries that depend on Russia's and Belarus's and Belarus's and Ukraine's commodities, they're going to have to go out into the open market and buy rubles, i.e. prop up the ruble. And this is going to be to the benefit of Russia, the Russian economy, and to the detriment of the dollar as the global reserve currency. And so this all around is a catastrophe for the EU and the United States. And let's not even get into the issue of the prices that we're going to have. At this time, as I'm speaking to you, the last quote I read was that gas was trading at $3,300 per 1,000 cubic meters. That is at historic highs. And for those of you who don't know, 1,000 cubic meters of gas were trading at something like I think it was $700-800 as little as 6-8 months ago. This is a huge deal, and it is going to hit Europe like a hurricane. And so,
yes,
and of course, what will happen is that all of this money is going to go to Russia. Okay,
yeah.
so these sanctions are making the Russians rich. And,
Yes.
this is the topsy-turvy logic of these people, and all of this could have been predicted. Everybody knew that this would more or less happen, and it's happening, and everybody's so surprised.
You are completely correct, Gonzalo. Can I just quickly add to those things that you mentioned? There is a whole list of other commodities. I was just reading yesterday, for example, that Russia produces 40% of artificial blue sapphires. They're apparently essential for semiconductor manufacturing.
Oh, really?
That's a very, very difficult thing to reproduce. They provide neon gas. They provide all kinds of things. Palladium, titanium, you name it. They are absolutely central to all kinds of supply chains. And straightforwardly, I don't think they thought it through. I remember reading just weeks ago, God, it seems like an age, reading on the White House website some anonymous US official, obviously it was Jake Sullivan, talking about how Russia is this one-dimensional economy and how, we can plow them and crater them and do all those kind of things to them. And he clearly wasn't aware of the vulnerabilities of his own economy. And of course, the US has lots of natural resources. It's still at the center of the trading system. It will come through. I agree with you about the dollar. We'll come to that in a moment. But Europe is screwed. I don't want to say this any other way. It is completely screwed.
I can't believe, Alexander, you're using such language. I thought better of you.
I mean, it gives you an idea of how strongly I feel about this, because we have acted in the most, and I say we because I am a European. I mean, I am born in Greece. Greece, of course, is the nation that gave Europe its name. My father was part of the person who created the European cultural capitals and all that sort of thing. So he's absolute European. I live in Britain, which is a European country. I mean, I'm as European as it possibly can be and gets. And we have just done this insane thing to ourselves. And we're going to, I've said this before, this is the moment of the irreversible decline of Europe. It will not recover in my lifetime. The US dollar hegemony is going. I completely agree. We could very well see the petro ruble before very long. In fact, I'm sure you're right about that. We could also probably see the agro ruble before very long. I'm sure you're absolutely right about that. But the US doesn't need the global reserve currency position of the dollar to still remain a big economy and a world power. I mean, in fact, my own personal view is that it's become over-reliant upon it, and that once that prop is kicked away, all kinds of things that the US still has, which would make it a strong country and economy, would come back. But in Europe, we don't have anything like that, and the level of our political leadership is abysmal. And I realized we were in serious trouble. I come back to this when they were all meeting at the Munich Security Conference, and they were all like a bunch of teenagers at a party, each one daring the other to go further, and they're all excitedly talking about all the great things they were going to do, and not a single person took a step back and said, hold on a minute, what are we saying? What are we doing? And one final point, Gonzalo, what you were saying about the Federal Reserve Board having opposed the SWIFT disconnection, I now know for an absolute crystal and categorical fact, I never doubted what you said, but I now have it corroborated from a third source. That third source is Tom Longo. He is, of course, in the financial community in the United States. He gets all kinds of messages from all kinds of people. He says that the Federal Reserve Board has been going around telling absolutely everybody in the Wall Street banks, in the dealing rooms, we were not consulted about this. We advised against the SWIFT disconnection, and we were never even informed that there was any sort of plan to sanction the Russian central bank. So you can see that the Fed is already trying to distance itself from this disaster. And notice that Christine Lagarde and the ECB are almost completely silent as this disaster starts to work its way towards us.
Yeah. So I mean, okay. So we're it's shocking, but I have nothing really intelligent to add to your analysis, except, oh my God, have you seen what they are doing? That's basically the intelligence of my commentary insofar as this, because it's shocking. You know,
it's shocking.
This is something that a generation ago the people in charge would have never allowed to happen.
No.
And the current leadership, they are so blind and stupid.
Yes.
They don't seem to understand the limitations of American or European power, or American or European economic power. And
yes,
they just went blindly off the cliff. And see, Alex, to your point, we were just before the show started, you were wondering, out loud, if this was on purpose. I wish it were, because at least it would show some agency on the part of these people.
Yeah.
I think that they didn't think it through. I think that they're just so arrogant and blind, incredibly intelligent people, high IQ people, but with no judgment. And without judgment, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you're going to wind up doing incredibly stupid things like these people have done. I wish it were on purpose, because it would denote that they have a plan, that they have agency, that they know more or less where they want to go. Here, they have no idea where they want to go. And by the way, I predicted yesterday in my stream when I was talking about this, and I did a little short video on YouTube. I clipped it out of my long stream. I said that the gasoline in the United States would hit $10 a gallon in 30 to 60 days, and already today it's hitting $6 per gallon. Now, for Europeans, that's absurdly cheap, but for Americans, it's shocking. And I think that this is going to keep on galloping up, and I think that. Really, $10 might be on the low end of the ultimate price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States. So, America bros, you're in trouble.
Well, we're only 1 week into these sanctions as well. Keep that in mind. And already everything is unraveling. And the point that I was making before we went live, Gonzalo, is that the fact that the Biden White House is now desperately trying to get the JCPOA wrapped up so that Iran can get back on the grid. The fact that they sent representatives to, of all places, Venezuela, to meet with, of all people, Nicolas Maduro. I don't know, did they send Guaido there, or what exactly do they have in mind? But the fact that they did this shows that this was not planned at all, shows that they are absolutely incompetent, and they're scrambling. That's exactly what this move shows, that they are absolutely scrambling to find some sort of solution to the problem that they themselves created. And what was the solution that they came up with at the end of the day? Let's get the JCPOA figured out, and let's get on a plane to meet with Maduro. So maybe Venezuela can help us out. I mean, everyone needs to take a step back and look at those moves and say, you're telling me now that the EU and the US and the Ukraine regime, that they're winning? Yes, they delivered a terrible.
This reminds me of when the whole natural gas issue started coming up. They were talking about getting natural gas from Oman, and you're like, what are you talking about? That's like that's a dribble for an ocean.
This is on Biden.
Point. It's desperation, because they know that they did something stupid and they have no solution to it.
Sorry. This is on the Biden White House. This is on Sullivan and Clinton and all these people. Newland. Absolutely. This is all on them.
I mean, can I just say? I mean,
and so my question, actually, Alexander, once you answer that, is how do you think Venezuela and Iran are going to act as well? Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I mean, let's assume that Maduro is an utterly cynical person. He's going to ditch the Russians tomorrow. He's going to tell the Americans, well, we'll do everything you want. Anybody who knows about the situation in Venezuela knows that the oil industry there is in a complete mess. It is simply not functioning properly. It would take at least 2 years to get production volumes up to anything remotely like what they were before the sanctions, before the crisis in Venezuela was imposed. Now, here I'm going to defer to you, Gonzalo. This is to some extent, this is your region. This is a part of the world that you know. I think
but you're better informed.
To understand, one of the important things to understand about Venezuela is, yes, there's been sanctions on the country. Then they've done a lot of harm, but that doesn't take away the fact that there has been a massive amount of economic mismanagement. And that is extremely difficult to turn around, and to turn around fast. And besides, even if you could sort it out, even if, as I said, you could get production volumes up, I cannot imagine that even Maduro would trust the Americans so far as to do it. I mean, why would he put himself in a position where he becomes, in effect, once more economically dependent upon them? I can't see that happening. And in terms of Iran, there again, I think the point to understand is that all Iranian oil, once the sanctions are lifted, is already committed. And it's committed to where? It's committed to China. And these are already existing contracts. And by the way, Iranian gas, natural gas, it's already committed, do you know to whom? To the Russians. They did all these big deals with the Iranians just about a year ago, which, by the way, looks suspiciously prescient, if I can say so. But anyway, there we go. So, as you absolutely rightly said, it's Alex, this is desperation.
Yes.
It suggests a complete inability to understand what has hit them, and that they're scrambling round to Maduro and Raisi and Khamenei and people of that kind to drag, and MBS as well, who apparently has stuck up the 2 fingers at them to try and see whether these people can sort them out. I mean, it just shows what utter incompetence, what complete fools these people were.
Well, it also shows something else. It shows how clever the Russians were long term to build such enormous goodwill with all the people that you're mentioning. Because now, all of these people, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, they don't really want to mess with the Russians because, number one, they're a bit scared of them, as they should be. But number two, the Russians have always been straight shooters with them. And they've always acted as a moderating and conciliatory element in any negotiation. And they've made it a point, the Russians have made it a point diplomatically. And this, you have to give credit where credit is due. Lavrov was very clever in this way of consistently trying to build goodwill. And always, when you say something, you mean it and you stick with it and you don't change later at your convenience. And so because of it now, okay, Maduro might do something with the Americans, but he'll only be looking at it cynically as a way to get some short-term leverage out of the Americans. The Iranians, same thing. They're going to go into the negotiations in Vienna and try to get their points, but they're not going to be trusting the Americans one iota. They're going to be thinking, okay, I understand what's going on. How can I get these dumb Americans to give me what I want right now? Because later I'm just going to screw them over because they'd screw me over. See, and that kind of mentality, one has to understand that nations are made of people. Diplomatic corps are made of people. And so the people remember. And so the diplomats remember when the Russians said something and stuck by their guns and delivered as they had promised, even if it might have cost them in the short term. And they remember how the Americans would say one thing and then backstab you. A new administration would come along and all the old arrangements would be thrown out the window and it would be chaos once again. And so people remember these betrayals. And sometimes they remember the most trivial things that one would think there's no big deal, but for them was a huge deal because at that moment it meant a lot. And when you betray people like that, They remember, they resent you, and when they're going to have the opportunity to take advantage of you and hurt you back, they're going to take it. And I think that the Americans are realizing this. And the final point, the fact that the American diplomatic machine is doing these idiotic moves of trying to make friends with Iran that they've demonized for 40 years now, and now they're trying to make friends with them. And the same with Venezuela. It's so transparent that nobody can take it seriously on the one hand, and on the other, it shows, to me at least, proof positive that they did not think any of this through. They just decided to do this emotionally, irrationally, and now they're going to pay the consequences. And the people who are going to suffer are the everyday Americans who are going to pay much more in food, much more in gasoline, much more in most of the products that they use, because most products need to be shipped. And how do you ship things across the United States? Usually by truck, sometimes by plane. Both of them use gasoline or jet fuel. Same thing. And those are all going to go through the roof. By the way, to my American listeners in New England, where I used to live, I would suggest right now you call up your heating oil provider and top up your entire your oil your oil tank for the winter heating, because we're 10 months away from the next winter, but buy it now, because in 10 months you're not going to be able to afford it. I mean, I think I'm that serious about it, and I think that the Americans have done something so catastrophically bad for themselves that they haven't even realized it yet, but I think they're beginning to realize it.
I agree. Can I just repeat a point which I've made in previous programs? I got about a week ago, 10 days ago, a letter from, this is before the war. This relates to costs that were already accumulating before the war, from my energy provider, telling me that my household energy bills on the 1st of April are going to rise by 54%. 54%. Now, that doesn't factor in what's happened since. I mean, it doesn't factor in the sanctions. I've already been alerted, not by my energy provider, but by somebody else who is in contact with my energy provider, that in the autumn, I will see another rise, which could be more like 100%.
Oh,
100% more than what I would be paying on the 1st of April, not 100% more than what I am paying now. So, I mean, that gives you some idea of where this is going.
You're talking about 150% more, basically.
Absolutely.
Buy blankets, go long on knit blankets. That's my financial advice.
So that gives you some idea of where we are. And of course, this is now it's not hit most British people, but it will very soon.
Yeah. How do you think this is going to affect Europe, small businesses in the US?
Right. Well, let me talk about,
especially
Britain.
given the 2 years that we've also come off of.
Let me talk about Britain, because of course in Britain, households, there is an energy cap. There's an energy price cap, so that we do eventually get the full price. It comes in stages. It comes over time. Businesses, especially small businesses, they don't have the protection provided by an energy price cap, so they are already being hit. And what I'm hearing from right across Britain is that companies are now really struggling, and they're struggling very hard. And of course, to the extent that we still have any manufacturing industry in Britain, we do actually. We've got quite a lot. I mean, this is absolutely catastrophic for them. I mean, and by the way, British industrial companies, to a great extent, are still concentrated in those seats in the north of England and in the Midlands, which voted for Brexit in 2016 and which went to the Conservatives in the 2019 election. So, if there is a major crisis there with companies having to close down, and that is a real possibility, all of this happening with an explosion in food prices, in prices of practically everything. Car prices are going to just explode well, then, as I said, the political effect of all of this is just, well, it just doesn't bear even thinking about. So that's Britain. The other country I know quite well in Europe is, of course, Germany, where I've got family, and in Germany too. Germany obviously has a very much heavier industrial footprint than some other European countries do. That makes Germany very energy intensive. They're going to be very badly affected by all of this. There's a strong cultural aversion to inflation in Germany as well. And on top of all of that, the way the German industrial system is organized makes it extremely difficult for German companies to work efficiently or indeed at all in high inflation environments. I mean, you're talking about, this Mittelstand of medium-sized businesses. They're constantly getting inputs. If the inputs are rising, it's really, really tough on them. So if inflation starts to go up into double figures, which to me now looks inevitable, that's going to cause major stresses in the German economy. And there'll be demands that the German government do something to bring it back under control. Inevitably, this being Germany, there will be demands for higher interest rates, because this is the traditional way in Germany that you bring inflation under control. I don't know that it would work this time, by the way, because you're talking about what is a supply shock. But okay, you do that. Put up interest rates in a high inflation environment. What that's going to do to the euro, I'm not even going to try and work it out. I mean, I can quite easily see the euro facing a crisis, the euro system facing a crisis like we've never seen before.
Yes, I would agree. I would think that if the Germans control the euro, let's make no bones about it. I mean, the European Central Bank is in Frankfurt, not Brussels. And so my thinking is that the Germans will demand, because of long historical reasons, they will demand a strong euro, that the euro not succumb to inflation. And so they're going to push for high interest rates. And this, of course, will tear the Eurozone apart, because there are countries in the European Union which cannot survive a strong euro with a high interest rate in a generally inflationary environment where commodities are inflationary. They can't survive it. And I'm talking not of the smaller economies. I'm not talking Portugal or Greece. I'm talking, the big ones like France. That's the one I'm worried about. And I think that kind of stress on the euro, insane as it may sound, it may spell the death knell of the euro, the currency, for the entire eurozone. That France might find itself in a position where it has to break away from the euro, and just because, I mean, one can already see the screaming matches that are going to start to happen between the French financial managers and the German financial managers, and this will rise up to a level of French president versus, the German chancellor. And I think that that insane as it may sound at this time, if this goes on for like a year or two, let's say that this really starts rearing its head in 6 months, which is perfectly reasonable, and the tensions created by a strong euro, a German demanded strong euro in a softening economy in the rest of the Eurozone. Well, in a year's time after that, that is 18 months from now, it could be that the French decide we can't take it. We can't take it anymore. The French are not known to put up with a crappy economic environment for very long. They might decide to throw up their arms, throw up their hands, and just go back to the French franc and devalue and survive what seems to me will be a inflationary depression. Because I think that is basically what we're looking at. And correct me, gentlemen, if I'm wrong.
You're not wrong at all. Inflationary depression is a very good way to describe it. This is not stagflation, as people are talking about. It is actually a depression with higher prices. Something we're not used to, and which many economists would tell you just can't really happen. But
it's
happening, you see, because most economic recessions or depressions have their origin in monetary policy. Well, monetary policy in the West has not been good being measured for a very long time now. But you've added to that problem, which has already, of course, caused very high inflation in the Western economies, something which Gonzalo and we at the Duran were predicting. I mean, especially when the new administration came in and thought that they could just prime the pump and it wouldn't, any inflation would be transitory. Remember all that? Anyway, but I mean, monetary policy has been terrible. Fiscal policy has been, if anything, worse, at least in the US. But what you're now doing is you are now adding the mother and father of all supply shocks to it. I mean, if everybody is running around looking for oil, then the price is going to rise, because there's always going to be less oil than there is demand. And if you consider the question of supply and demand, then if there's always going to be more demand for oil than there is supply, however depressed the economy becomes, then oil prices, energy prices are going to rise, and everything else all the other prices have to commensurately rise with it. We've never been in a scenario exactly like this one. The closest we came to it was in 1973 during the time of the Arab oil embargo. But that only lasted for a very brief period. It was just a flash. This time, this looks like it could last a lot longer. In fact, it looks semi-permanent. And of course, what's astonishing is we've done it to ourselves.
Yes. Just the lack of judgment of the people in leadership have led us to this position. And we're not even talking about the possibility, which is realistically being floated by very clever people, that we might wind up in a nuclear war. I mean, quite apart from that, we are looking at an inflationary depression, which, as you correctly pointed out, a lot of economists claim, that's impossible. Well, it's possible and it's happening. And that's the thing that I can't understand, how people could be so reckless and foolish. And it was not that hard to see what would happen. I mean, I understand on a logical level why this is happening. I understand that the leadership currently, they thought that the structures that currently exist are so solid, so rock solid, because they grew up among them, that they never thought that any kind of stress on these structures could ever bring them down. But they're being brought down by their incompetent decision making, because of their foolish notion that the economic and geopolitical structure that we have been so blessed with having over the last 40 years, that structure was so solid that no abuse would ever really harm it. Well, the abuse has harmed it. It's broken it. And I do not see any kind of way out. The other thing I want to point out, and to pivot the conversation a little bit, it seems that on March 11th, the Kremlin decreed that on March 11th, all internet services must be on Russian soil. Skype has been closed in Russia. Facebook, Twitter, no longer in Russia. That was a decision of Facebook, a decision of Twitter, a decision of Skype. The Russians, tit for tat, decided, okay, then all Russian services, Yandex and all that, they have to have their servers in Russia and no communication. I mean, essentially a digital divide. What do you gentlemen think of this chasm that is opening up between the two blocks?
Well, it is. I mean, what we're seeing is, and I say this with huge misgivings. I mean, I don't like this at all. But we're seeing the Chinese model being adopted by Russia. I mean, that's essentially what's happening. And again, a lot of people said it was technically impossible. The Russians would never do it. Well, they're doing it. It's happening now. So we're going to see the RUNet, the Russian internet. The RUNet is going to follow where the Chinese net has already gone. It's going to build its own kind of Great Wall, and it's going to function inside it. I still hope And one has to be very careful because there's been moves made against radio stations like Echo, Moskvy, and all those sort of things. But I still hope that they will allow a greater degree of debate and openness within Russia than the Chinese do. But that's where we're going. That's where we're heading. And again, we led there.
Yeah.
We started this. I mean, this obviously is bad for us because it reduces our capacity to influence people in Russia, to build bridges to people in Russia, to develop civil society there. But we initiated this game. I mean, how can we complain now when the Russians take retaliatory action, given what we have done to Russian media agencies, which some of which are now completely unobtainable here?
Yeah, like RT is unobtainable, and also the United in the West has also indulged in the censorship of cancellation, canceling people, individuals, but also now websites. RT is gone. But the other thing I don't understand about the West's ideas is that, see, canceling some things like Netflix, like all the West's soft power, that's just stupid. Because I mean, that soft power acted like a siren song to the Russian population.
Yes.
But you're removing that very subtle but very powerful tool at your disposal by shutting off Netflix and all the other media companies. And I'm sure that soon enough it'll be YouTube and all of the Google products.
Absolutely.
That's in the cards.
Yeah.
And so I don't understand the foolishness of removing your most powerful assets just to virtue signal.
Yes.
It's the religion of the West, Gonzalo, now. Yes. I mean, whether we like it or not, and I'm not saying there's a majority of people that subscribe to the woke culture, but you could say 20-30% of the population in the West does subscribe to it, and that is the religion. And I think it's important to point out that a lot of the cancellation of Russia, people, the language, media companies, etc., has been done without the pressure of the European Union or the Biden White House. A lot of companies like Netflix and like the cancellation of cats and restaurants removing Putin from the menu, or words that sound like Putin in Canada.
Yeah, Putin.
These types of things. This isn't the Biden White House, going to Netflix or going to these restaurants and establishments and saying, you have to cancel, Russia. They're doing it on their own. They're doing it voluntarily.
Yes.
Well, this is the most troubling part of all of this.
Can I just
canceling?
My nose? Yeah. I have to point this out. Just a little anecdote. An Italian university that canceled Dostoevsky.
Yes,
one of the crown jewels of Western civilization. I mean, I don't think that anybody would disagree with this. One of the great writers of history, and he was canceled because he's Russian.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing it to themselves. They're censoring themselves now, and they don't even, without an understanding that the minute this conflict ends, and we go to this new two-world order, this new Iron Curtain, all this cancellation is going to be weaponized in the same exact way it was weaponized on the Freedom Convoy in Canada, but it's going to be weaponized to a large extent, to a mass extent. It's going to be weaponized on all the people. What happened in Canada was just a trial balloon. And everyone that's cheering this on, this on, it's going to be turned right back at you. So when Alexander says that, Russia is going to turn out to be the Chinese model, we're all going to turn out to be the Chinese model.
Well, indeed. Absolutely correct. Absolutely right. Yes. With the important difference, of course, that the Russians have. I mean, they've worked like that before. We in the West, our great strength was that we never went that way. We always had, since the 18th century, we had freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of ideas. And of course, that was what made us attractive to the world and strong. If we're simply going to be another kind of China, and frankly, why not go to the real thing? I mean, they make more nowadays than we do. So I mean, that we are destroying the single most important asset and quality of our civilization. And that's something that, again, depresses me to an incredible degree. I mean, it doesn't just depress me, it distresses me to an extraordinary degree. But can I just also say, and just to remind you, both of you, whether I'm in touch with this person who is, a GOP organizer in the United States. He's somebody who's got various GOP Congress people on his mailing lists. I get his mailing shots. He is in despair. He has pointed out that supporting all of these restrictions, cancellations, all those sort of things, now that are being applied against Russia, all but guarantees that come 2024, there will be brought out and used against the GOP. And I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, of course it will. I mean, if you normalize this kind of thing, then it's going, I mean, where it looked as if, the GOP, the Republicans were, 2024 is increasingly looking like a sure thing. Well, all those people, the Rubios, the Ted Cruzes, the Lindsey Grahams, all of these people are acting in a way that's going to make it otherwise. and
because they're going to turn this on Trump.
All
of this is going to be aimed on Trump in 2024. If Trump was smart, he would be screaming about this and saying, look, I don't agree with X, Y, and Z and all these things. That's fine. But he would be saying we can't continue to cancel to the degree that we're canceling, understanding that all of this is going to be turned right at him come election time.
Yes. Absolutely, and I completely agree. But I don't think it'll just be Trump. I have to say that if it's DeSantis, for example, why wouldn't they turn it on him?
They will.
They will. That's where it's heading. I mean, if you can't access a media company, I'm not here to defend RT. I mean, there's a lot of things about RT I don't like, and I disagree with profoundly. And I think that in many, many ways it went in the wrong direction and it lost its way. But if you simply drive it, make it completely inaccessible, and nothing of it now is accessible in Britain. You can't. Its app doesn't work. Its website is under constant DOS attacks. It's been driven off terrestrial TV, driven off cable TV, all of this done without a single decision by Ofcom, by the way. I mean, it's like a switch has been pulled.
Yeah.
But if they can do that to a whole TV station, then they could do it to anybody.
And they trial ballooned this with Press TV. Let's not forget that. They did it to Iran first.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I hate to say it, but the first one to go, and I knew it was a mistake and a disaster, was Stormfront, the neo-Nazi site. I certainly have no interest in a neo-Nazi site, of course not. No. But I realized that was the first moment. If you were willing to shut down a website that was extremely distasteful, nobody's questioning that. But if you're willing to get rid of a website and prohibit it from, and not just being on the web, but also, and the key issue is the financial infrastructure and the communications infrastructure. If you're willing to do that to the neo-Nazis, then you're willing to do it to anybody. And it's just only a matter of time before you have created a situation whereby you are, quote unquote, canceling everybody and anybody. And it will be for completely arbitrary reasons. Your entire society will be mob rule, and it will be a disaster. And that's what we're seeing, it seems to me.
Absolutely, bearing in mind that there's no legislation that authorizes it. And if there was, it would be contrary to the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which is the true defender of democracy. It's not somebody deciding, I don't like so-and-so, somebody in some office somewhere in San Francisco in the Bay Area saying, I'm the judge, I know what democracy is. That's not how you protect democracy. You protect democracy through the rule of law, through the Constitution of the United States, observing its provisions, observing the Bill of Rights, having it administered properly through the courts. And can I also say, and here I speak as somebody who most of his life was spent in the legal world. I was never a human rights lawyer, it must be said, but I always took an interest in human rights law. One of the institutions one of the legal societies, one of the legal groupings around the world that I always massively admired was the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And way back in the 60s, they made a massive campaign around restrictions that had been placed upon, well, I'm going to call it an ultra-right group, but, its views probably are not so different from the website that Gonzalo was talking about. There was attempts to try and suppress it, and the ACLU in those days defended them. Now, they were all, obviously, the people who worked in the ACLU were all obviously left-wing people. We're talking about the 60s. And anybody who works for the ACLU at that time, especially, was going to be left-wing. But it was the issue, the principle of freedom of speech, of free expression, of what were the rights under the law, the rights safeguarded by the Constitution. And it was, in my opinion, in the opinion of many people, including many people in the legal community, one of the ACLU's greatest moments. And today, where are they? They're cheering all this. They're cheering all this, business of shutting things down and closing them down and doing all those things. Again, I ask myself, is this America? Well, it's certainly not the America I used to know and used to love and admire so much.
Yeah. That was a Skokie decision you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's right. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's despicable, and it's so shocking how the principles that both of you and myself grew up with have been just thrown out the window, defenestrated without any kind of ceremony. Just yes, that's the way things are, and it's the right of power, not the power of right. It's so it breaks my heart, and I don't say that lightly.
It is the abnegation for me of what America is, or what America was, and what for me it stood for. Terminate with extreme prejudice. That it seems to me is what now is the governing philosophy of large parts of the political class of the United States.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my rant for the day. Sorry.
it just makes me want to cry, to tell you the truth.
No.
And I'm not laughing. I have to laugh, or else I will cry. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because everything that we admired about the United States is just gone. And what is so depressing is that the people who are now operating the United States, who run it, it's like they're wearing a skin suit of what America used to be, but inside they are not even monstrous, they're just incompetent. That's the thing that bothers me the most, because if they were truly nefarious, I would be like, well, they're really evil people, but at least they know more or less what they're doing. But here, no, it's just sheer incompetence. That is the depressing part.
The depressing part to me in all of this is anyone that even speaks out in defense of, say, RT or Sputnik News or that Russian conductor who was fired, or that opera singer.
Gergiev,
you're called, what are you called? A Putin stooge or a Russian stooge.
Yes.
Right away. It's incredible, because I sit there and I hear these people saying, oh, you're a Putin stooge, you're a Russian stooge, because I believe that RT should be allowed to broadcast. But you know what? If that makes me, a Russian or a Putin stooge, then what does that make you, who's supporting the ideology of Schwab, Soros, Clinton, Obama, Biden? Are you a Schwab stooge? Are you a Soros stooge? I'll take that trade-off. I'll agree. You can call me a Putin stooge as long as you accept that you're a Klaus Schwab, George Soros stooge. Even fine.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, guys, going back to our original topic, I just seen from Zero Hedge that the German government has said that they are imposing an embargo on Russian oil. Well, they also said, of course, that they opposed a swift disconnection, and it happened. So I wouldn't place any reliance upon that. But the Germans coming out publicly and saying that has just caused oil prices to dip. I have to say, anybody who treats that assurance from Berlin with any kind of confidence is, I think, deluding themselves.
I can't believe it. they've decided not to buy Russian oil.
No. They've said that they're opposed to any decision not to buy Russian oil. That's what the German.
Okay.
That's
thank
what the
God.
German,
I thought that they had
yeah,
completely gone out of their mind. Okay.
Well, I, as I said, Gonzalo, don't assume that this line will hold.
Yeah, because Pelosi's pushing hard.
Exactly. They said exactly the same about SWIFT. The Germans said very clearly, and were saying a few weeks ago, that there was no way that they would ever agree to disconnect Russia from SWIFT, and of course it happened. So with this bunch in Berlin, don't have any such expectations. But anyway, for the moment, they've probably been told by their friends in industry, the unions, for example, in industry, which are very influential with the SPD, that under no circumstances do this. But
I wonder if this will wind up splitting the Americans from the Europeans definitively, because I'm sure that the Americans foolishly, without any kind of empathy, will demand that the Europeans cut off their oil supply from Russia.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that might wind up becoming a wedge issue between the continent and the Americans.
I used to think so. I used to think that there would come a point when the Americans would demand something, and that the European political class, specifically the German political class, would put its foot down and say no. I have to say, with this particular German government we have now, which is, to be very clear, the worst German government we've had since the Second World War, by far. I mean, every other German government I've seen up to now has been, I haven't always liked them, but they've been led by people, who what one had to take seriously. I mean, even Angela Merkel, whom I absolutely didn't like, I had to take seriously and acknowledge her very real political skills. This bunch are awful. And I have to say, I think if Biden phones up Scholz, and if Blinken speaks to Baerbock and Habeck, I think more likely than not they'll fall into line, and they'll do something which will take Europe down even further. But we'll see. For the moment, the Germans are trying to push back, but place no reliance on it, because, as I said, we've seen this happen before. We see the Germans talking about what a bad idea SWIFT disconnection was, and then they caved.
Yeah, from what I understand, the Americans import something like 3 or 4% of their oil needs from Russia. You gentlemen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe it's around that figure. I mean, very, very low, but still something that could affect you. But the point is that the Americans can, with some alacrity, cut off Russian oil, and it will hurt, but not be a complete end of the world scenario for them.
No.
And so perhaps out of some misguided notion that, it doesn't hurt us that bad, so you Germans should do the same as us, they'll push the Germans to this brink. And I don't think that the German economy would survive cutting off Russian oil.
No. Russian oil, Europe imports a quarter of its oil from Russia. And this is a tight oil market. There is no replacement for it. I mean, even Maduro can't come to the rescue there. I mean, it just can't be done. And besides, I mean, I'm not an expert on oils, but, you can't just substitute one type of oil for another. You can't replace Arabian Light with Urals crude. It doesn't work like that. So, but if they do that, if they switch off a quarter of their oil supply, which these people are, I think, capable of doing, because, as I said, they never think these things through, then, as you correctly said, it will be a disaster for them. But sanctioning Russia's central bank, cancelling Nord Stream 2, and de-swifting some of its key banks was already a disaster, and they did it.
You guys are talking. This is a great conversation, and you guys are talking a lot about oil. But can both of you address some of the other commodities and the other resources? Because I think Russia has stressed the fact that this is going to be an asymmetric retaliation, and we kind of saw a hint of that with the JCPOA and Lavrov's statement with the JCPOA saying, "You know what? I might nuke the JCPOA if we can't, trade with Iran." In a much broader sense. And I thought that was an interesting asymmetric position that he took. We have wheat, we have metals, we have fertilizer, there's travel. I mean, what do you guys see as far as some other ways that the Russians may retaliate in an asymmetric manner?
Please let me respond this, because I've given it some thought, and I've done a little bit of reading on this specific issue. I think the great weakness for the Europeans is the agro commodities, not just wheat and barley, but also the fertilizers. I think that is where they can really squeeze the Europeans so hard, squeeze them until they scream, quite frankly. I think that's where the Russians, if they really want to hurt the Europeans, that's how they'll do it. And because between Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, it's essentially, I mean, just to round it off, it's basically 25 to 30% of their agro needs, of Europe's agro needs. You can't survive if you lose roughly a third of your needs for food in terms of the actual food itself, and much more importantly, the fertilizer. Because if you don't have the fertilizer that you need, especially in these developed plots of land where the soil has long ago been exhausted, and you need artificial fertilizers to be able to grow crops, the essential crops for your people. If you don't have that, it's lights out. It's over. I mean, you're going to have people going hungry, because there will not be enough money, and the poorer people, and especially the working poor, the lower middle classes, those are the ones who are going to suffer catastrophically, because of course they pay a larger share of their income into food. And so the era of cheap food is over. The era of being able to buy 2,000 calories for €5, that is gone if the Russians really, really want to hurt the Europeans. And I don't think that the Europeans have thought it through enough at this time.
No, they haven't thought it through. I completely agree. I absolutely agree with you about agriculture. Now, again, this same person that I was talking about, this person who works with who works within the GOP and who's a congressional person, he's been making this point about fertilizer and all these problems about food since, I think it was November. He's been banging away at this particular drum. And again, he says it's incredibly frustrating because you're not listening to me. He talks to Congress people. You're not listening to me. You're not listening to the experts. And that's in the United States. And by the way, the US is a huge agricultural producer, and you would have thought that people there would listen and would understand about these things. And I suspect there are some who do. In Europe, we don't. That's the other great problem. I mean, in Europe, the political class in Europe has very little understanding of industry and technology. I mean, that isn't really where they come from. I mean, basically, they come from the media world. If you look at their ultimate backgrounds, I mean, they're journalists. And of course, to the extent that they have any knowledge of industry and finance, which is limited, they have no knowledge at all of agriculture. It's not something that attracts them. It's not, sexy and attractive. And besides, if you are a left of center politician in Europe, you don't like farmers very much because they tend to vote right. So, I mean, you get all that kind of thing. And, they tend to be social conservatives as well. So, they know tiddly squat about all of this. And they are desperately, disastrously out of their depth, and always assume, and Gonzalo, you said it so well earlier in the program, that all these structures that seem so solid and which have existed so long will still continue to be solid and will continue to exist, that they can do whatever they like, hold their teenage parties, make their weird decisions, and somehow ultimately it will stay stable because it's the stability they've always known throughout their lives.
Yeah, and I'm dumbfounded again at the foolishness of these decision makers, and Alex, bail me out, because I'm just dumbfounded at the stupidity of these people.
We've got a lot of questions. You guys want to get to some questions?
Let's get on to the questions. Yeah, let's do questions.
Let's run through these questions quickly. There's a lot of good questions and comments in general. So Let me pull them up here because I'm also dumbfounded. I'm stunned. I'm stunned at this. I mean, and I'm living in Europe, so I'm not happy about everything that's going to be coming our way. But what can we do? It would be interesting to see how Europe reacts to all of this. How the Europeans react to all of the things that are going to be coming their way. A lot of chaos is about to hit. V-Plan says, thank you so much for your objective analysis. Russia historically had a lot of corruption in the army, and there are rumors about poorly maintained equipment left behind, tires collapsed, etc. How do you perceive the improvements in the military equipment? You have those rumors that the Russian equipment is falling apart in this conflict, and the supply lines are all messed up. And
I think that's just picking up on some random bits of information that don't necessarily translate to the entirety of the Russian armed forces. And also, there was a minister of defense before Shoigu, an individual whose name I forget, but he was referred to as
Serdyukov.
He was the man who I believe reformed and revamped the Russian military. And really went to town insofar as cleaning up the corruption of the Russian armed forces. And this was way back in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s, I believe. And that since then they've had a emphasis on meritocracy, of having the best men and the best equipment succeed. And so I don't think that that's an issue. And insofar as maintenance issues, yes, I've seen some people say, oh, look at this tire of this truck. This must be indicative of the entire Russian armed forces. And that just seems a little bit stretching it, to tell you the truth.
I entirely agree. Can I just say, I've been hearing these stories about the Russian armed forces since, way back into the Cold War. It's just a trope, in my opinion. I mean, there may be times when it was true, or at least came close to being true. But the fact is, they always seem to get there in the end, and that's ultimately all that matters. I mean,
they have lousy tires and lousy maintenance, and yet they're still winning. So how does that exactly work?
Yes.
Does that mean that maybe that we should not worry about having squeaky clean maintenance, and that way we'll win a war? I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I'm not, as I say, a military person, but I have read World War II history, and I remember that you go back that far, you find all kinds of German commentators at that period, German writers at that time, officers, soldiers, military people saying that the Russians, they might have been brave fighters, but they had no technical skills and things of this kind. And their T-34s, their tracks fell off and their guns fell off and the shells bounced around, but it didn't stop them getting to Berlin. But I mean, seriously, you can read it there. I mean, I think it's just a meme, frankly. I don't think it has any. I wouldn't place any reliance on it.
It's cope. It's cope.
Because
you want to hang your hat and be able to say, "Oh no, they're not that good." And see, here's evidence. Here's some random picture of some, truck stuck in the mud, and this proves that they are not really good. And it's just a way to cope. Yeah, that's what I think.
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that.
Rich says that Russia has a very advanced industrial base. What the West also ignores is that the materials like titanium, palladium, etc., Russia supplies is of the highest grade because Russia developed the advanced equipment processes to refine them.
This is entirely true. Russia's great weakness, and I know this economy quite well, by the way. I mean, I'm not talking about things I don't. Russia's great weakness, they're very, very good at, the very advanced technology stuff. They're very good at agriculture. They've now got a pretty well-organized service industry. Where they are much more income dependent is in some sectors of the consumer goods production. And obviously they import a lot of consumer goods, but, like Lada cars uses things, spares that, provided by Persia, for example. Textile brands, they import cotton. But, and this is something which I have experience of, I should say once upon a time, this is long, long time ago, I worked in insolvency. I worked very heavily in insolvency work in Britain. One of the things that very, very strongly struck me at the time, because, when you're doing insolvency work, you work a lot with textile, consumer goods manufacturers, light industry, because they're the people who are most vulnerable. What always amazed me was the incredible flexibility of that part of the economy. Really high technology, you could tell, big industry, takes a long time to turn around. But at that kind of end, you can adapt and find new supplies and come up with new ideas and organize restructurings and do all sorts of things within an incredibly short time. And businesses which looked like they were about to fold would turn around within about 2 weeks. And, and that is not an exaggeration.
Good point. Yura Gabor says Hungary is refusing to give any kind of military support for Ukraine and won't let it enter any weapon transports via Hungarian territory to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Orbán will sing a different tune a month from now.
Yeah, actually, can I add to that is that Poland has just announced that they will not host any kind of European aircraft going to fight in Ukraine. I mean, they've been adamant about it. And there was some news organization that was saying that Poland was fine with this. And the Polish Ministry of the Exterior, I believe, I could be wrong, but they made a statement and went all over the social media to say, no European planes based out of Poland. We are not getting involved in this. We'll help along, but we're no planes.
I know that story very well, because the news organization that was promoting this story over the weekend relentlessly was the Financial Times. And I'm absolutely furious about that, because I again remember when the Financial Times used to be a serious newspaper. And it was obvious to me when I read it that it was fake news. And it was, in fact, the chancellery of the Polish prime minister who actually came out on Twitter and said, this is fake news. We are absolutely never going to do anything like this. Now, I think that if Orbán is re-elected, I think, on the contrary, he will stick to his line. And I will say this again. I was talking to somebody from Hungary on Saturday. Alex knows whom I'm referring to, and I also have other contacts in Hungary. My personal trainer, for what it's worth, is Hungarian, and they all tell me exactly the same thing. They all tell me that the Hungarians are absolutely determined to stay out of this, and this isn't just people who support Orbán. It's many of the people who support the opposition as well. They're too close to this affair. They know Ukraine far too well to want to get dragged into this particular maelstrom.
Very good. John McGuire says, what is your opinion on the almost complete lack of reference to Russian hybrid warfare by the experts? And as the days pass, it seems obvious this is a game, considering the first Russo-Ukraine conflict had 14,000 plus casualties, in reference to the Donbass, I believe, John.
I've never taken this whole hybrid warfare thing at all seriously. At least not so far as the Russians are concerned. Yeah, I mean, look, they're very good at deception operations. They are very good at electronic warfare. They do all that sort of thing. But the point about hybrid warfare is that this all originates from a misquotation of something that the chief of the Russian General Staff, a man called Gerasimov, said some years ago. He talked about the need for Russia to counteract Western hybrid warfare. And a British commentator, whom I, by the way, know briefly, Mark Galeotti, took all that up and talked about how Gerasimov had written a piece about hybrid warfare. And people took Galeotti's piece and said that the Russians had this concept of hybrid warfare. It was, stage by stage by stage by stage. The words first, Gerasimov's article, comments were distorted. Then Galeotti's articles about Gerasimov's comments was distorted as well. And we ended up with this concept of hybrid warfare. How can the Russians conduct hybrid warfare? What does hybrid warfare even mean precisely if we are talking about information warfare? Well, as we're seeing over the last 10 days, when it comes to information warfare, the Russians aren't even on the starting blocks. I mean, all the advantages, at least within the Western world, are held by the United States and its friends.
I've noticed, yeah, I completely agree that I think that this whole notion of a hybrid warfare, it's just like a cool meme, like a cool term that you can throw around in some think tank or in some policy paper, something like that. As a practical matter, it seems very clear that the Russians are just conducting a good old-fashioned 19th century war, to tell you the truth. I think also what they've been very smart about is they've made sure that their ministries of defense and foreign relations, whenever they make a statement, it's true, or it turns out to be absolutely true. They never try to, put out a lie. They try to stick to what's actually true and not propagandize. And I think that perhaps they're saving the big lie for later on. But so far, this has proven to be very useful because you can more or less trust what the Ministry of Defense of the Russians is saying. But you cannot trust what the Ukrainian Zelensky regime is saying because they lie with just about every breath that they take. It's constant propaganda, constant morale boosting with lies and fairy tales, whereas the Russians are very like, this happened, this happened, this happened. And on the one hand, the Zelensky regime is absolutely winning the Twitter war, but the Russians are coming out ahead in terms of credibility, and so I think that that's more important in the long run, especially as this thing is playing out.
I agree with that. Can I just again go back to my family from Germany? And as I said how incredibly effective the German information machine during the war was, if you lived in Germany, and how widely it was believed. And I mean, apparently, because people could hear Western and Soviet broadcasts, the Germans won out every time on that. I mean, this is something I had not appreciated, but within Germany, people believed it completely. But it didn't stop the Russians getting to Berlin. And that's always the thing people have got to remember. You can win information war, but at the end of the day, it's the kinetic war. What's what happens on the ground that ultimately makes the difference.
Gonzalo, I want to ask you a real quick question. I know that you've been involved in the entertainment world, so you understand this world fairly well. Can you give us some insight as to how the Zelensky regime has acted or is acting, given the fact that you are dealing with Zelensky himself being an entertainer? Much of his cabinet comes from that world. I mean, I've seen screenwriters, TV producers. I mean, do you have any insight as to how these guys are thinking, maybe before the war and during this war?
Well, of course, it's very easy. They have a fantasy of what they believe that they can do. And they see, in the entertainment business, in order to succeed, in order to produce a movie, for those of you listening, I started out as a writer. After I got my degree at Dartmouth, I went to Hollywood to work as a screenwriter. And I was lucky enough to be a bit successful at that business. And then I pivoted into writing novels, and I was successful at that. And so I know and I would later produce and, in fact, direct movies in South America and Chile. And I can tell you that a lot of times what you do is that you pretend that you have a project that will work out. And a lot of times, you fake it until you make it in the entertainment business. And because it is a business that depends on force of personality and persuasiveness. For instance, I am a producer. I have a script and a series of actors who have committed to that script, and a director perhaps who is committed to that script. And you two gentlemen are financiers. And I go to you and I start to pitch you the movie, and I tell you how wonderful it's going to be. And by force of my personality and my persuasiveness, I try to convince you of the reality of this project. And many times that force of personality, that ability to convince people, that makes them sign the checks to make it happen. And so you get used to this notion that I just have to convince people that this is happening for it to become a reality. And I do believe that Zelensky, and certainly his puppet master, which is Kolomoisky, Igor Kolomoisky, a Ukrainian, Israeli, Cypriot businessman who currently lives in Switzerland, who is the power of Zelensky. He controls him. Zelensky has no political experience before becoming president. He was just a movie star in Ukraine, a local movie star, very successful at it, but again, just an actor, not a politician. Well, it was Kolomoisky who sort of like put him into this position and surrounded him with a retinue of handpicked advisors and cabinet members and whatnot. And of course, the key issue is these bullies, these thugs, these hired muscle that were part of the Azov battalion, because Kolomoisky is the man who financed the Azov battalion and financed a lot of these very shady neo-Nazi organizations. And parenthetically, it's very odd that a Jewish financier would be the one to finance a neo-Nazi group in Ukraine, but here we are. Well, these people believe that if you convince others of reality, then the reality comes into being. And so I believe that is what's happening. They have this this mental model that this is how reality is. You convince people, and it becomes a reality. And the Russians are simply saying, well, it doesn't matter what you say. What matters is how many troops are on the ground and how do they flank your city and surround it and take it over. That is what matters. And so you see the difference between essentially a social media war and an actual war. And only one of them matters in the end.
Yeah, I agree with that completely.
All right. Rob says, this is a good question. What's stopping Biden from restarting Keystone, and why the shale industry, public companies, so afraid of investing in CapEx again? Do you think oil rise is a short-term phenomenon? If so, for how many years?
I don't think that it's a short-term phenomenon. I think, on the contrary, it's one that's going to be long-standing. Now, can I just say, I mean, I am not, again, I'm not an oil engineer, I'm not a geologist, I'm not any of those things. I think if we're talking about Keystone, all those things, it's because ideology and the green commitments that this administration have made make it extremely difficult for him to change policy on this. I mean, it's one thing probably to talk to Maduro, and it's one thing perhaps to talk to Khamenei. The progressive wing of the party might wear that. I think it'd be much more difficult to get them to accept a total switch on their beloved ecological projects, to put it mildly. But even if that reverses, even if you start going down the shale path and doing all those kind of things and reopening Keystone pipelines, it's not going to be anywhere near enough to sort out the oil and gas issues, because shale has anyway only a limited life, and secondly, there just isn't enough of it. You can come up with any kind of dodge idea. You cannot replace the world's second, or is it third, one of the world's big three oil producers. It can't be done.
No. Yeah.
Very, very good. GEC says Russia has the new PD-35 engine. Boeing's decision to sanction Russia may increase Russia's production target to above 100 airplanes per year within 5 years.
Well, that's possible. Now, can I just make a point? They do not yet have the PD-35. They have the PD-14, which is a much smaller aircraft engine, but a very advanced one. And that's already now rolling out in production. And you have the MS-21, which is their transit jet, which is coming out, which is a narrow body. But bear in mind, for internal airline traffic, the MS-21 is about to enter production. For internal traffic, that's mostly what you need. The big wide bodies are more necessary for international flights. The PD-35, which is comparable to the big General Electric engines, that will probably appear in the later 2020s. When the big wide bodies start to appear, if you're going to go, you can use 4 PD-14s on an adapted Ilyushin 96. So you could have a wide body with international, range with 4 jets, but that's becoming economically unattractive. What you want is 2 big jets on your wide body, and that will start to appear in the late 2020s. But it's not the point I'm trying to make is it's not quite as soon as you say, but ultimately the Russians very much wanted to rebuild their aircraft industry, which after the Soviet Union collapsed, essentially imploded. And by the way, often for very good reasons, because not all Soviet jets were very good jets, and that's being generous. But they struggled to build jets, domestic jets for themselves, because it was always commercially more sensible to import them from Europe and the United States. So even a company like Aeroflot had to have its arm twisted to invest in buying Russian jets, because of course production of Russian jets was still at such a small level. But now, of course, that they have no option but to buy Russian jets, you will start to see them coming out in much greater quantities in the next few years.
All right. Eurogabor said, I meant that Orban will start to punch above his weight once again in Brussels once he bags the election.
Okay, I misunderstood you.
So he has to walk a fine line.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I absolutely do agree, actually.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Yeah, I think that Orban is the only other heavyweight politician that we currently have in Europe.
Yeah.
I can't think of another. Yeah.
No, I can't think of another.
I mean, really Putin and Orban as the heavyweights. I mean, irrespective of their positions and the countries that they lead, but of capable leaders is yes. My point. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you can make an argument for Erdogan to a certain extent, even though he's erratic and he makes many bad decisions, but he does understand how to play the game.
Yes. Exactly.
But it's that very erraticness that sort of like
Yeah, he's a player. He's at the table, but But
he makes a lot of bad bets.
Yeah, but he makes a lot exactly. So
Yeah. And I think that the Russians are waiting for the opportunity to punish him over the Kazakhstan intervention. I think that really must have just really bothered the Russians. That he seems to have been mixed up in that business. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah.
The Chinese think so as well. The Chinese are furious at him, actually. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Shane says the mainstream financial advisory journal said the risk of nuclear war is now 10% in the next 12 months. How real is this threat?
Can I point something out to that? This idiotic notion of like, it's X number of percentage points.
Yeah.
Compared to what? I've always found that absurd, kind of, But anyway, Alexander, you were going to say?
You took the very words out of my mouth. Actually, not quite the words. I mean, I just don't take that. I just don't buy that. Why would the Russians use nuclear weapons? They're winning the war in Ukraine. So what's the point of that? The Pentagon isn't going to intervene in Ukraine. They've made that absolutely clear. They've set up a deconfliction hotline with the Russians. There's maybe going to be attempts to get an insurgency going in Ukraine. I think that's an incredibly bad idea for multiple reasons. But I don't think that's really realistically going to start nuclear war. I think, and I don't think that anything that Putin said has in any way threatened one. I mean, again, I think we must be extremely careful about not falling into the trap of accepting that what other people say Putin said is what the man actually did say. So I don't think this is a real danger at all, actually. And I think it doesn't help to talk about this. It distracts from the real problems, which are the ones that we've been talking about on this program and which Gonzalo talked about in his Telegram channel, which is the problems in the world economy, where we have just exploded the economic equivalent of a nuclear bomb under ourselves.
Yep. And a reminder for everybody, I have Gonzalo's link to his YouTube channel in the description box down below, his new YouTube channel. which is doing really, really well. And there is that link down below. Please, everybody, subscribe to his channel. And let's see. RDDR says anti-war left splitting over Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's.
Are they splitting?
I think they are actually. Bear in mind that
is there an anti-war left?
That's absolutely right. To the extent that it exists, and it's microscopic. I mean, the force that brought out 1 million people onto the streets of London in 2002 to protest the Iraq war. I mean, it's just vanished. It's just disappeared. It's been, and to the extent that it exists, it has indeed split. I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that the anti-war left in Europe, which used to be a very powerful force, is something that doesn't exist anymore. Wow. How it came about that it collapsed so completely is a very interesting question, one with many answers, but I'm afraid that would take a whole further program to look into it and to discuss it properly. But the anti-war left in Europe is gone.
Yeah, I would say 2 words to explain why the left turned neocon. One word is Clinton, and the other is Blair. I think that those 2 politicians sort of like swerved the left in a direction that has caused so much damage. But I agree. It's a 3-hour conversation.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
David, thank you for that super sticker. Max Gonzalo, what are the chances of the West backtracking on Russian sanctions?
None. 0.
Yeah.
Because these people don't have the humility to recognize that they made a mistake and to walk back the mistake. You see, you gentlemen and I think that we're all grown up enough to realize that when we say something that's wrong or do something that was incorrect or foolish, we have the self-assurance and self-confidence to say, I did something foolish. I'm sorry. I'm just going to have to backtrack or change my opinion or change my mind or just, face up to our mistakes. But the people who are leading us, you have to understand that the reason that they are in positions of leadership is that they have spotless records. They are people who graduated from the right universities and did all the right internships, and they never made a mistake. They never had any substantial failure. And so because of this, they grew up spotlessly. And now that they have actual power and they are running things, they have no experience with failure. They have no experience of how to deal with a mistaken judgment and walk it back, turn it around and say, no, this was a mistake and we shouldn't have done this. We should have done, instead of Y, we should have done X. They don't have that experience. And so in this case, I do not see them walking back the sanctions. I think that their pride and hubris will prevent them from doing such things. The very fact that they're reaching out to people like the Iranians and the Nicaraguans to figure out a way to plug up this hole in the oil production proves the fact that these fools cannot admit to a mistake, walk it back, and just move on. They can't. They are constitutionally unable to do so. Alexander, would you agree with that assessment?
I completely agree with you. One would love to see a situation where somebody like, say, Jerome Powell comes along, rocks up to the White House, says to Joe, "Dear Joe, what have you been up to? This is absolutely insane what you've done. Let's try and find a way around. We're going, everything is going to pieces." Or where Christine Lagarde or some technical person telephone Charles Michel or Ursula von der Leyen or Hambeck and but it's not going to happen. That's even if we get a 50% collapse in production and 75% unemployment, they wouldn't do it. I mean, these people have no reverse gear. I think that's the important thing to understand. These sanctions that they've imposed are not going to be reversed. I don't think the Russians have any doubt about that, nor should we.
Yeah.
Sparky says high IQ for Western leaders is too much credit. Thank you, Sparky.
No, I'm sorry. I beg to differ. I beg to differ. Yeah, we can mock them, but the thing is, see, they truly are intelligent in an objective level. They lack judgment and they lack humility. And this is the great tragedy. And this is something that I started noticing without being able to articulate the way I am articulating now, of course, but I started seeing the hints of this in the early 90s when I was in university in the United States, that extremely intelligent people who are exceptionally compliant, exceptionally willing to just go along to get along, and they never stick out. And that's how they advance. They have to go along with the groupthink, no matter how absurd. And so they never learn to make their own judgments and stand up for themselves and stick out. And so, because it takes a great deal of experience in sticking out to be able to do so at such critical moments and critical junctures as we are experiencing today. You see, you have to train yourself to stick out and stick up for a judgment that might be very contrary to the acceptable wisdom, the accepted wisdom, the conventional wisdom. But the people who are in charge have never had to do that because they advanced by keeping their heads down, by doing what everybody else did, by not sticking out. And that's why we are in this situation. But they're not stupid. That's the great mistake, is to think that they're stupid. They're not. They just lack moral courage. I would put it in those terms. I don't know if you gentlemen would agree with
they
me.
Have no. I agree. Look, I've my wife is an academic, and I've seen how. And by the way, she's an academic at a very good university, one which has made a real policy of trying to keep debate open, where people are allowed to say it. But I've seen, as a result, through my wife, what has been going on in the academic and intellectual worlds in Britain, and by the way, also in the United States and in Europe. And one of the things that's happened, and it's been extraordinary to see, is how academic education has changed in the last 40, 50 years, and where it actually sought to be challenging and rewarded people who went out of their way to think differently. Now, the way to excel and the particular skill set you need to excel in an academic environment is to be as conformist as possible and to be conformist in the right way. And that does require, unquestionably, a certain intelligence. I mean, it certainly does. What it doesn't require is an inquiring intelligence. And given the route of political leadership, you go straight out of university, you go into internships at either journalism or some light forms of law, or more often now increasingly into political parties and political activism. You don't have that sort of bottom of political leaders in the West who'd worked their way, they'd built up their businesses, they'd worked in, really heavy finance law or criminal law, or who'd been, if you were on the left, they'd worked up their way through trade unions and who accepted setbacks, learned mistakes, learned from their mistakes, gradually acquired that kind of level of experience. You don't have that any longer. And that's why so many of them, by the way, are so young as well. I mean, once upon a time, politicians in Europe, in the United States, the average age, at least in Europe, would be people in their 60s. Now, if you're over 40, I mean, you're already seen as somebody who's, frankly, older than tooth. I mean, it's just extraordinary to see how it's worked out. So these are completely the wrong sort of people to be running a country.
Guy says that CRP is perfectly describing the mid-wit. Thank you for that. Let's see. Red Line says, in an empire of lies, truth is a weapon.
True.
Empire of lies. That's getting out there. I'm hearing a lot of people.
It is indeed. It's picking up. It's picking up. Good is good. Yeah, it's picking up. It comes from Solzhenitsyn, I believe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I'm a big fan of Uncle Sasha.
Well, there you go.
Teo, thank you for that super sticker. And I Metmore says, if Poland intervenes in the war, do you think NATO will follow?
No, they won't interfere.
No, they won't interfere. Exactly. I mean, they've already ruled it out, and I don't think they're going to do it. I have contacts in Poland, and people are very worked up there, but there's no support for Polish people going out and fighting in Ukraine. That's not.
Yeah, because the Poles have actually been invaded by the Russians. They know not to mess with them. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, I again, speculative on my part, and you guys know how I love to go out there on the weakest branch. But I suspect that some people in Poland are thinking, Lviv might be there for the taking. I mean, it's perhaps they're not saying it in those words, but they're definitely thinking about it, because Lviv is an ancient itch, and they want it back. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yes.
I think with the right diplomacy, if things go the way we're seeing them go, the right diplomacy, they just might get it.
Yeah.
I think, by the way, that Putin talking about how if Ukraine continues in this path, that its existence will be called into question.
Exactly.
I think he's already made up his mind.
Exactly.
I think that this is just laying the groundwork for a partitioning of Ukraine. I think that this is in the cards. I think that the Lugansk and Donetsk might break off, but the whole Novorossiya, that is this long tongue of land from the Kharkov region, perhaps Poltava, stretching all the way to Odessa, and certainly all of the coast of the Black Sea. I think that all of that, they are eyeing it as a separate republic, and I don't think that they are thinking to themselves that they want to integrate it into Russia. Crimea will go back formally into, well, it already is, I think, formally in Russia, but this Novorossiya will be a satellite state, a puppet state of some sort, and Ukraine will be reduced to maybe a third of its size around Kiev, and it seems clear that when Putin made that statement, basically a veiled threat that if you keep on annoying me, I'll just start breaking you up. I think he's already made up his mind in that direction.
I agree.
Yeah.
I would also make the go ahead, Alexander.
No, I agree. I just want to say I agree.
I would also make the point that if somehow Poland, Hungary, and Romania were able to break away from the European Union from a negotiation diplomacy standpoint, I bet you that Russia would definitely sit down with him and find a way to stabilize the West, given all three of those countries have claims to areas there.
I think there isn't going to be a Poland and Hungary breaking away from the European Union. I think that
for diplomacy's sake, I mean, like van der Leyen, just leave us alone. We need to talk to these guys. That's
perhaps, but I think that what might happen is that as the economic situation in Europe begins to deteriorate, and as the incredible stresses between the French economy and the German economy start to rise due to the Germans' unwillingness to have a weak euro, I think that disintegration of the eurozone will allow the other peripheral nations of Europe to sort of like slink away. And do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't know if that is that might wind up being what happens, that the whole European project sort of like disintegrates, because at the end of the day, the whole European project was the notion of tying up France and Germany so tightly together that they would never go to war again. And it might be that central relationship that gets so fractured over a inflationary depression in Europe that leads to the whole European artifact disintegrating like a sandcastle, and these smaller countries sort of like drifting off, if you will.
Yeah.
Does this make any sense to you?
No, it makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. Commando Crossfire says, repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth. Well said. And GC says, good cop, bad cop being played by Russia and Chechnya? ? A lot of people are talking about Chechnya. I think maybe they're giving too much.
I think they are, to be quite honest. I think it's also Kadyrov wanting to reassure Moscow, the Kremlin, that Chechnya is totally loyal and can be relied upon. So I don't place a huge amount of credence on this. They're fearsome and very tough fighters, but in a war like this, I think that they're not really the tremendous force that people think they are, and I don't think you should overstate their role.
Yeah. Rascal says, gents, watch Roses Have Thorns Part 6 Odessa Massacre on YouTube. First firsthand, up close, uncensored footage. Watch police standing by to watch people butchered by the NZs. Gonzalo is right about civilians.
Yeah.
About what?
Right
What? I don't quite understand what was said there.
You're right about the civilians. Your hunch about what's going on the ground with civilians, human shields, all of these things being implemented.
In Mariupol, the civilians are not being allowed to leave the city through the humanitarian corridors at the instigation of the Zelensky regime. And so that gives you a clue. They want to use the civilians as human shields, the cowards. I mean, that's all that they are. I mean, there I have, it's a concentration of these Azov battalion thugs, whom I consider just criminals, just to be treated as criminals. And the military justice, insofar as dealing with criminals, is very clear, and I completely support that, because they are not an army. They are thugs, criminals, allied to a government that was bought and paid for by an absent oligarch who thought that he could get his way and rape Ukraine and destroy the Ukrainian people. I'm sorry. I get very emotional about this particular issue.
Yeah.
I see Sarakin says it took 35 days for Germany to conquer Poland at the beginning of World War I. Germany lost 59,000 troops.
And there's also half the country, because remember the Soviet Union conquered the other half of it.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah, that's true. Khalil says, once Putin succeeds in occupying Odessa, would they go as far as Transnistria and Moldova proper to secure the Bessarabian Gap, which can also include parts of Romania? Good question.
Well, that's a very good question. I don't have the grasp of the geography or of the strategy to understand this. But if Odessa were to fall under Russian control, then there would be in effect, it seems to me, a land bridge going all the way to Transnistria. And I presume this is what's being talked about here. I can't say more.
Yeah,
I just don't really know.
Does that? No, I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Transnistria, fine, you create that land bridge, but I think the question takes it one step further.
To Moldova,
Alexander,
as well.
do you then turn your attention to Moldova, and then absolutely Moldova, you look at Romania?
I think unlikely. At the moment, very unlikely. And besides which, I mean, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I mean, Putin and the Russians have their hands full with Ukraine at the moment. I don't think they're very interested in Moldova at this time.
No, they're not interested in causing problems for themselves.
No, exactly.
That's the bottom line. Why would you go and make problems for yourselves, for yourself rather, by threatening Moldova or Romania in any meaningful sense? I'm sure what will happen is that as the Russian army comes close to that border, they will communicate with one another, the two armies, the army of the Russians and the Romanians, and come to some quick and very civil kind of arrangement, so that there's no mistakes and no accidental incident, because there's no upside for the Russians, and the Russians are not at this time. I mean, they don't have any interest in those countries, so why would they bother? Quite frankly,
exactly. Yeah, I agree with that.
Tim says, as Hussar 63 says, can we call the cities by Russian names?
Gonzalo, I am going to be completely neutral on this. I think we should call cities by the names that the people who live there call them.
I agree completely.
Right. James says, why doesn't Russia require payment in gold and or silver? That would make heads implode. No?
I don't think there's enough gold.
A lot of people talk about this.
I know.
You hear this a lot. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, people always talk about gold, but Alexander, you're completely correct. The amount of gold in the world is dwarfed by the amount of fiat currency. So as a practical matter, you could never have a currency backed by gold at this time. The global economy is simply too complex and too big. So that's and also if you trade in gold, the hassle of moving physical gold around, it's a nightmare. Okay. And so the idea, oops, you winked out. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. Am I still there? Can you see me?
Yeah, all good. Everyone's good. Everyone's good.
Good. No, I was just the point is that dealing with physical gold is a hassle, and of course, if you're dealing with any gold broker, your gold certificate is only as solid as the broker, And so it's a hassle, just go with the fiat currency. And the Russians, of course, they're going to be thinking to themselves, well, we want to be dealing in rubles so that our foreign customers are forced to essentially prop up our own currency, which is basically what the United States has been doing for the last close to 80 years. So, I don't see anybody seriously doing anything with gold. I think that the Russians removing the VAT tax of 20%, the value-added tax of 20% that they had slapped on gold purchases in Russia, I think that was more a PR move than a real. It's not going to change anything in a real sense of the economy of the global or the local economies.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you link the value of your currency to an important tradable asset like oil, for example, I think that's much more fair. Now you're talking exactly. I think gold, everybody gets very worked up about gold, and it has its uses. But I think people need to also understand its limits. And I think I agree with all the points Gonzalo was making.
Yeah, Sparky says the petro ruble.
The petro ruble,
yeah, exactly.
And the agro ruble as well.
And the agro ruble as well. Yeah, exactly. I see Sarah Kid says Israel is the only smart nation not to sanction Russia. They agree to bar oligarchs, but they cannot survive without Russian commodities.
Absolutely. And of course, Bennett, who's the Israeli prime minister, has been to Moscow and has met Putin. So
I heard he basically flew out to Moscow and Putin said to his face, "Butt out," basically. That must have been kind of humiliating, actually.
I know.
I bet you wanted to talk about the JCPOA as well.
Yeah, I'm sure he did.
Good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
GA Freckles, thank you for that super chat. Commando Crossfire says the Russian military of defense and Ukrainian refugees accuse Ukrainian nationalists of shooting civilians trying to flee or accused of collaborating with Russia.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going around.
Flying Boar asks, what's the update on African and Indian students stuck and held hostage in Ukraine? Good question.
It's a huge row about Indian students. Modi telephoned Putin, Putin telephoned Macron. They had a furious row which lasted for 90 minutes, and it was basically about the Indian students, as I've subsequently learned. Absolutely. And it was Indian students in Kharkiv, apparently, who weren't able to get out, and the Kremlin readout, which I haven't read, by the way, on the Kremlin website because it's unobtainable, but the Interfax news agency provided a copy of it. Anyway, Macron said that he talked to Kiev, in other words, to the government there, and I gather that the Indian students in Kharkiv have finally been able to leave. All I will say about this is that this is the one story which is difficult for the Ukrainian government, which has managed to break through to some extent into Britain. Even in my, in my neighborhood, we have a neighborhood intranet. We have, we sort of chats and WhatsApp groups and things of that kind. But people have been talking about that particular incident, about African and Indian students having problems in Ukraine. So it's the only thing I've seen of an anti or of a critical Ukrainian nature, which has actually broken through. Where we are with this, I simply don't know. Whether this problem continues or it's been solved, I really don't know.
That's very interesting because, as you gentlemen know, I'm a Chilean citizen, and Chile has no diplomatic mission to Ukraine, and Ukraine does not have a diplomatic mission to Chile because the trade is insignificant between the two nations. And so the Chilean embassy in Warsaw handles all Ukraine affairs. And so when this crisis occurred, there are less than half a dozen Chilean citizens in Kharkov, in the Kharkov area, and that includes my own two children who were born in Chile, and so the Chilean embassy in Warsaw was trying to organize a way to evacuate all Chileans from Kharkov, and they had latched on to the Indian delegation, which was organizing this convoy, I suppose, of Indian students, because apparently there are a lot of Indian students at the Kharkov universities here, because Kharkov has several universities, several large and very good universities. And so because of this, I was advised by the Chilean embassy that if I wanted to flee, I should join these Indian students. And for various reasons, I declined the offer. But I was aware of this, and I thought that the Indians had a clear path out of the country. And so I'm very surprised at this news. And it's very interesting that the Ukrainians would not have treated the Indians well, or realized that a lot of other nations had, for lack of a better word, they'd glommed on to the Indian exodus. And so this is very interesting.
I mean, this is just what international reports have said, but as I said, it's been talked about here in Britain. Now, again, I mean, I don't have direct access to this, but I mean, I don't know what's going on the ground, but it has certainly been talked about here in Britain as well, which makes me think it must be true.
Sparky says many U.S. decision makers are people who think food begins in the back grocery store. Those who don't never give it a thought in the first place.
Yes.
Well said. Well said, Sparky. Herding Cat says, just watch part of the Yuval Harari interview on Ukraine. Oh my God, the gross hypocrisy and BS. Will this help the World Economic Forum somehow?
I'm afraid I don't know who this person is. The more I think about this, the more I'm convinced this is not going to help the World Economic Forum. I think crashing the world economy in this particular way, I don't think that was the plan. I think the plan was to crash Russia, not the world economy. And I think that there are the first signs of panic now in Europe over this.
Yuval Harari. Yuval Harari is the author of the book *Sapiens*, which was a big bestseller about the evolution of human beings, of Homo sapiens, and also there was a sequel book. It was a big bestseller, and he is also an advisor to Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum. He is an American-Israeli intellectual academic, one of these people who's sort of like in this NGO academia World Economic Forum blob, if you will. And he's one of these people who's been pushing for the Great Reset and the New World Order and all this nonsense. And I would agree with you. I think that the idea that I think their goal was basically to break up Russia. They had been talking about breaking up Russia into smaller bite-sized pieces that they could exploit to their heart's content. And Vladimir Putin and the current Kremlin regime clearly had other thoughts in mind. And so here we are. And as I said in my live stream yesterday, I think in the end, this whole situation economically will benefit Russia in terms of actual income, and also it will benefit it in terms of shoving it into being completely independent, and it will hurt the European and American economies, especially because they are so fragile at this time compared to the Russian economy, which is hardened because of the foolish sanctions over the last 8 years.
I agree with that. I agree with every part of that.
Yeah. Guy, thank you for your super sticker. Appreciate it. And Summer says the military-industrial complex will be the death of us all. Ain't no war but class war. Very true.
Well,
ain't no war but class war. Especially today, it is a class war everywhere you're turning to. It is a class war. Commander Crossfire says Ukraine forces are planning to blow up a nuclear reactor at the institute in Kharkov. Foreign journalists arrived. But 1 second. Foreign journalists arrived to film and prep for accusation against Russia. Russia says Kiev is trying to scrub USA labs.
Well, I've heard all of these stories. This is the kind of thing, and what one has to take. I take with great care, because the Russians make allegations, the Ukrainians make allegations. We can't assume that any of this is true. So far, I heard that story about the Ukrainian lab, and so far nothing like that seems to have happened. That's, I think, all I can usefully say.
Yeah, the Russian Ministry of Defense came out and said that this was the plan, and they came out and said it first. And a few hours later, it started, coming out that the Zelensky regime was planning on doing this, of causing some sort of false flag incident at the Kharkov nuclear facility. I wasn't even aware that there was a nuclear facility in Kharkov, to tell you the truth, and I live here. And that was a little bit scary. And again, the Russians have no interest or motivation to cause any kind of nuclear accident, whereas the Zelensky regime has all the incentive in the world to have a nuclear incident happen and then blame it on the Russians. So I tend to believe the Russian Ministry of Defense, and there's this this incident that seems to have become a non-event insofar as the Kharkov nuclear facility. Now, insofar as the Russians finding, I think that this is a real story, by the way. The Russians finding biological warfare sites in the areas that they have captured. This seems to be true. They have been releasing documents about this, and I've been following this. And it seems to be accurate that the Americans apparently had been funding work on anthrax and plague in different locations in Ukraine. And the Russians have produced documents that seem to show it, documents and other evidence that seems to show that this is true, including documents from the United States telling the operators of these facilities in Ukraine to destroy all of the material that they had been working on and how to go about destroying it in a way that would not, implicate them back in Washington. Now, this is what the Russians are producing at this time. We'll have to see over time whether this is real. But at this time, it's enough evidence that one hesitates to think that it's not true. Okay. Right. But at the same time, it'll have to play out over time. And as to whether it will become, something that a lot of people are actually upset about, and if it has any kind of political significance. But at this time, it seems like it might be true, even though it seemed like a wild and insane kind of conspiracy theory. But stranger things in this war have happened, so we'll have to wait and see.
We'll wait to see. Yeah.
AD says the intentional direct close combat with Ukrainian Azov battalions, the best trained guys, almost from the Russian side without close air support, which they used in Syria. It is a message to NATO for the future. It's an interesting comment.
No opinion on that.
No opinion. Guy, thank you for your super sticker as well. And AD says, consider an idea, of course, of Russian action since 2000s in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, non-EU, non-NATO, then Ukraine, European non-NATO, putting the West to the test. So the next step will be.
I interpret every one of these moves that the Russians made as ultimately reactive. Yeah. I don't see why they would want to go beyond this, and I don't think they have any plan to.
I think it stops at Ukraine. Yeah. FBI Glowboy says, I think the Biden administration is 50-50 between incompetence and malfeasance. Canceling Keystone Pipeline, stopping new oil drilling permits. The U.S. can be energy independent, but elites want an interconnected global economy.
I agree. But I still think it's not 50-50 incompetence and whatever. I think it's about 80 incompetence. I really do.
I agree with Alexander.
All right. Margaret says the Brandon White House is sending the entire Western world off a cliff.
Yeah,
that is
definitely.
That is true. Definitely there. Deborah, thank you for your super sticker. And Alsat says, should Venezuela recognize Kanye West as a legitimate president of the United States? Thank you. Thank you for
President
that.
Kanye.
President Kanye. He did run for president of the United States. That is true. Ivana, thank you for super chat. JT, thank you for super chat. Veteran Support says, I'm a U.S. veteran and I am no longer brainwashed. Thank you for telling the truth. Truth is lacking in my country. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, yes.
That. Thank you. Ralph says in 94602 Tugland, California, USA, RT.com has been accessible in various browsers on PC over the past week when so many claimed it's gone. It's gone until now.
Well,
so it has been canceled now.
Okay. Yes, it is completely gone. It is completely gone in Britain as well. I mean, there is no place you can access it anymore.
Terrible. Sarah, thank you for that super chat. And Freedom Autopsy Report says Big Tech is the new great heathen army. The November elections shall be 1776.
Yes.
Knight says Peter Zerin said that Russia will push to Romania. A lot of people are bringing up Romania in this stream, that Russia's going to push to. Is there people in Romania? Are you getting a lot of propaganda about that in the chat? Let me know. A lot of people seem to be worried about that.
Yeah, it's that I do not see that the Russians have any interest whatsoever in Romania or making trouble for themselves.
Exactly.
I'm not saying that the Russians are saints. I'm saying that they are practical people. And the Kremlin leadership, whatsoever you may think of them, they are very rational and they are very clear as to their motivations. So I do not see them thinking to themselves, hey, this is a good idea to go and invade Romania or mess with Romania in any way. They don't have any beef with Romania. And so why would they bother?
The chat is saying Moldova. Yes, we get this in Romania. So maybe the spin is on overdrive.
I think it might be a local spin, a local thing.
Yeah, a local thing. Yeah. Robert says, "Hi, Alex. I'm from Croatia. Some 200 Croatian mercenaries were sent to Ukraine? ? But by whom? Putin seems to be angry at Croatia. We should have stayed out of this. I am disappointed in my government."
I agree with that. I think that they should have stayed out of it. The Ukrainian president, I think, wanted to. The Ukrainian government obviously didn't. But 200 men, one more or less, isn't going to make a huge difference in this war.
Yeah, and I have also heard that British mercenaries, or call them what you will, contractors, have gone to Ukraine. I saw a video of them, and they're the small clues of, like, for instance, the fruit drink that they were having. It was clear that they were in Ukraine. And the Russians have been very clear that any foreign combatant will be treated as a criminal and subject to martial law, up to and including on-the-spot execution. So if I were a foreign fighter, I would be very leery of getting involved in this situation, because the rules of war, the Geneva Convention, the Russians have said outright, will not apply to foreign combatants in Ukraine. So
yeah. Ralph said, "I said RT is not gone for me. Others are reporting the same." Okay, so RT is operating where you are. It's interesting.
Okay, interesting. Yeah,
that's good. Let's see. Peter Lou says
RT is operating, but people are getting around the block. I think that's the issue.
Yeah, Peter. Exactly. Yeah. Correct. Peter Lou says, "I disagree, Gonzalo. The U.S. has done the stupidest thing by cutting Russia from SWIFT. The dollar as world reserve currency now has become untrustworthy. Many countries will seek alternatives. Same stupid actions by Visa and MasterCard." I think you guys actually agree.
I was going to say, I wasn't sure how you disagree, because I mean, unless I misunderstood.
Is that what you're saying? You're saying the same thing, right,
Gonzalo?
Exactly.
Yeah, yes. That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm kind of like a little bit just quizzical here. No, I think that this is a disaster for the dollar, and also we've already heard that Saudi Arabia, of all people, MBS is looking to diversify the Saudi portfolio out of the dollar. I mean, if I were the Treasury Department in the States right now, I'd be having a hissy fit over this. You don't want Saudi Arabia, of all people, to start exiting the dollar.
Yeah. And Khalil says the Romanian Moldovan narratives are coming from a U.S. think tank experts. It's interesting.
Those guys, man, they don't know when to quit.
No, they don't. That's what they're paid. That's what they're paid to do, though. Yeah. So
just annoy everybody.
Yeah.
Russell Hall says the left has no interest in free speech or any freedom. They want to be viewed as benevolent champions for the people so they can rob their freedom.
Today's left, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it really is.
Yeah. Freedom Autopsy Report says Germans have been a recurring stomachache for the world since Roman times.
Oh, no, we mustn't say that. I mean, I know German well. And as I said,
I'm a big chunk of my ethnic heritage is German Danish. So come on, don't say such things.
Anyway, thank you for the super chat, Freedom Autopsy Report, and it's emotional times. Elena Diaz says, how are airlines faring? I know Finnair was taking a hit. How are the others managing?
That's a very good question. How will they manage? I have no idea. How's Boeing going?
Do you, gentlemen? The airline thing has given me this thought that I want to share with you both. Have you realized that in the past we would hop on a plane and travel to other continents, other countries, without giving a second thought throughout the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s? But with this situation of COVID, and now this war, and now this enormous chasm that is opening up between Russia and the East, if you will, and the rest of Western Europe, and how we are entering into this inflationary depression, You know, that kind of connectivity, that kind of casual globalism, it's gone forever. It's not
Yeah.
returning. Even if combat were to end this exact second, the whole very careful structure, this very delicate architecture has collapsed, has been blown apart, and I do not see it ever recovering, to tell you the truth. And the old life that we enjoyed so thoughtlessly, we could say to ourselves, hey, we're in London today, let's go to the Maldives, for a week, and casually just jet off to the Maldives, to a paradise on earth, and then return to our humdrum lives in London. That's gone forever. And I think that we're not realizing it yet.
No, I'm afraid I agree with you completely. I mean, goodness knows, I know how hard it's been living in London to get to Greece. I mean, trying to get to Greece and I mean, I agree. I think that also, I mean, my brother-in-law lives in Singapore, and I've never felt more remote from him than I have now.
Yeah. I feel the same about my family in Chile, that it's another continent, and I frankly don't see myself going back there in many years. And to return to the issue of the airlines, I think very few will survive, and the only ones that survive will be the ones that have enormous state support. I think that's the situation that we're going to be experiencing insofar as airlines is concerned.
I agree with that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. It also makes the whole EU Schengen thing, in my opinion, completely useless.
Yeah.
Which was one of the big promises of being in the European Union. You can go anywhere and all of this stuff. I think that's completely useless now. It's also going to decimate a lot of countries, especially in Europe, that are dependent on Russian tourism. I mean, it's going to really hurt them a lot. It's all kinds of bad stuff. Mohammed says, would the EU not gain much from the Belt and Road Initiative by the time it's fully online?
Would the EU gain from? Well, I think they would, and of course, Italy briefly was a part of it. But will it be implemented now? Or at least, how will it be implemented? I can't help but think that a lot of what we're talking about, Belt and Road Initiative, and all that, at least the way we understand things like this, belongs to a world which has just vanished. So I've always myself felt the Belt and Road Initiative had its sea routes and it's all the ones through Pakistan. Principally, it was about integrating the Russian economy with all its enormous raw material resources and connecting it to China's and creating the greater Eurasia thing. I've always felt that was ultimately what it was all about, and I think that's going to become ultimately all that it's going to be about now. That's my own sense, at least.
Yes, like I said just now, that world is over, and it's a tragedy. My view is that the future is supposing that we come out of this war, that this whole incident, the Ukrainian incident, sort of like ends, but there is no wider war between the West and Russia and China. Well, it's going to be Russia, China, India, Iran, separate and their own universe. And they will be a completely separate thing from the West. And if that's the case, the West, well, Australia and Western Europe will be the appendages. And in the center will be frankly, and I hate to say this because it breaks my heart to say this, but at the center will be a broken America, because the United States is so over-indebted, so overextended on so many fronts, the military front, its economy, everything, that I think that this is like the thing that will break the camel's back, if you will. A hard spike in inflation in this over-indebted environment will just, it seems to me, will just kick out the legs of the whole American system. I mean, if I'm looking into the future clearly now, assuming that this war does not widen, it's China, Russia, India, Iran. That's the future. And the West, I think that this is the end. I mean, that's my thinking at this point. What do you gentlemen think of that?
Well, I certainly think it's the end of Europe. As I said, I expect Europe in 10 years' time to be an economic backwater.
Yeah,
And
I think sooner.
with
You really think 10
with
years?
soon 10 years, well, even 10 years. I'm being generous, but I think it's going to be an economic backwater. It's going to become increasingly a cultural backwater as well. And I think that's the direction. That's the direction of travel now, definitely.
Yeah. God, amazing.
It is amazing. I mean, it makes that really does make me weep.
Yeah. Yeah.
John McGuire says, I believe EU rules require a bit of overtime for this podcast. Kudos. Thank you, John, for that. Thank you very much. James says, will this be a new scramble for Africa, for North America and the Europeans, a new rush for African oil and a rush for an export market? How many people are talking about where Africa fits
lots of
into all
people
of
are
this?
talking about Africa. Of course, I know there was a lot of anger in London because at the UN a General Assembly, lots of African countries chose to abstain and refuse to, criticize Russia. And I gather that African opinion is tended to tilt towards Russia as well. At least this is what some people in the media here are saying. So there's been a lot of anger about this. A scramble for Africa.
China's already there, aren't they? I mean,
China's already there. I was going to say. I mean, I think that in any such a scramble, the Chinese already are pretty much tied it all down, I'd say.
Yeah. And let's face facts. As somebody from Latin America, Latin America, Central America, and Africa will always be backwaters. They will always be backwaters. And I'm not saying this with any kind of animosity towards Africans, just as I'm not saying it with any sort of animosity towards Central or South Americans, but it's the truth. At least in South America, I could say that we'll produce occasional great writers and great artists in different venues, but it's never going to be, Latin America will never be a powerhouse, and Africa much less so, because they haven't up to this point over the last 300-400 years. So to claim that they will at some point is to just sort of like have be caught up in magical thinking, as far as I'm concerned.
Raphael says this is the damnest group of politicians in power. Very true, Raphael. Sparky says no argument there. Sparky says high food prices especially hurt large families, and birth rates are already too low in the West.
Yes,
absolutely true.
Yes.
Very
Russia
true.
has those problems too. They've been battling with the birth rate problem for for a while. They had a handle on it for a little bit, but then the coup came.
Well, the whole birth rate thing, there are some thinkers who put a lot on it, but it's very easy to turn it around. And also what happens is that if you have a sudden burst of self-confidence in the population, all of a sudden you will have a baby boom. Okay. And if this concludes successfully from the point of view of the Russians, it will be a shot of adrenaline into the body politic of Russia, and it will translate into changes into what's going on with the people there. So a military victory changes people's attitudes quite a bit, especially when it's a military victory that does not actually harm the country, like what happened in the United States after the Second World War.
That is actually a very good point. Also happened in Germany, by the way, after the 1870 war. That there was a huge surge in the German birth rate because there was this great sense of optimism and rediscovery of confidence or discovery of confidence. And it was another factor that consolidated Germany's position in the end as the rising power in Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
And Green Vibe says for Africa, it depends on who's running the country. That is true. And Brazil is already a powerhouse. And Brazil is already a powerhouse. Very, very interesting comment. Andrew says, this is part of the Great Reset to create the necessary roadblock that justifies shortages, crashes the global economy and currencies, selling it to the public as all Russia's fault. You hear that narrative a lot too.
I hear that narrative. One hears that. I can see it. I have to say, I just don't feel that if it had been the plan, it would have been done in this botched way. But anyway, and would they really be going, as you said at the start of the program, to people like Maduro and Khamenei and asking them to help them if they planned it all out in advance?
Yeah, I think that's the giveaway. Would they go to Maduro and beg Maduro to help? No.
You do
Divine, yeah. Divine Insurgent said I tried buying Russian standard vodka at CVS earlier. It was in stock, but apparently I cannot buy it because 11 states have banned it.
Wow. Hey, by the way, it's not been easy to get Russian vodka in some parts of London for a long time now. I mean, I used to drink Beluga, which is a Russian vodka, and you can still find it. I mean, it's not entirely vanished, but it's not nowhere. Before 2014 or before the sanctions really kicked in, it was quite accessible, available. It hasn't been for a while now. And in my part of London, it's basically Polish vodka now, or standard, which isn't, I believe. Well, anyway, I mean, it does exist, but not all standard vodka, I believe, is made in Russia. But anyway.
City says that Russia is getting into Africa by signing military defense contracts in order to pretend Westerners from eliminating political leaders and destabilizing the countries.
I mean,
so I think I'm in the
Yeah.
chat, and definitely I think the consensus is that China, to a large extent, in Africa, China and perhaps Russia could stabilize things, I guess would be the right way to say it, or people are very positive about the role that China is playing. I don't know, Chad, if that's a correct interpretation, that Africa is positive with the role of China. Let's see. Conscious Gentile says, thank God for the Duran. Raphael says, when I see what is happening now in Europe, the world has not progressed much. Slavery can be reinstated in a minute and people will accept it.
I have to say, I too have been shocked by the kind of hysteria and the way in which we've been led along over the last few days, weeks. I mean, it has been for me a moment of real revelation. It's told me how easy it is to manipulate people. Intellectually, I've always known it, but it's still shocking to experience.
And Anatoly says, how will steel production and supply be affected?
Good question. Russia being, of course, a major steel producer as well, by the way. And neon gas, which I was talking about at the start of the program, which is part of the, which is used in semiconductor manufacture, being a byproduct of the steel industry, the Russian steel industry. So anyway, I think everything is going to be affected because, of course, steel production is extremely energy intensive. So even if you have iron ore in lots of places, if energy prices are rising, then that's going to increase the cost of everything, including steel. And of course, steel is enormously important in every part of the manufacturing economy.
Oh, no sense, says Alex Alexander. Thank you for your service. Gonzalo, resist, stay safe, and in good health. Please inform us about yourself and don't let haters get you.
Oh, yes, so true.
Thank you for that. Divine Insurgent says, do any of you remember the publication, the International Herald Tribune, before it was acquired by the New York Times? My father
of course I do.
enjoyed
I used to read it every day. Once
remember
upon a time. That was when, who goodness knows, long ago now, it seems.
David asks, is there a Serbian component to any of this?
I don't think so. I think there's a lot of support for Russia in Serbia, and Serbia's held the line on sanctions.
Yeah. Raphael says the State Department did truly believe that winning the social media war will help them win the war. This is insane. Facebook and Twitter was reality. Wow.
Yeah.
Good comment. Conscious Gentle says John 3:16. JW Moore, thank you for the super chat. Raphael says, I read an article a long time ago. The Panama Canal is the biggest strategic mistake made by the USA. Oh. Russia simply has to bomb it. That's not. East Coast will be flooded. Pacific is higher than Atlantic Ocean.
Let's not go to those places, please.
Let's not go there. Yeah. Thank you for that super chat, Raphael. John, thank you for your super chat. Kite Wind says, how unlikely is it that this situation is orchestrated by artificial intelligence? If it would happen, would it not happen like this?
I don't think so. I think
whoever's orchestrating this is not. I would take the intelligence part out of the artificial. Rayo says, I joined late and feel like numpty. Hope you guys are keeping well and are well rested.
We are keeping well, thanks.
The chat, thank you for that. Super sticker, Sparky, thank you for that. Elena, thank you for your super sticker. Arnold, thank you for your super chat. Guy says, I already read that. Coach Red Pill is perfectly described in the midwit. Yes. David Murch says, we are starting to see people who make Renaud and Chamberlain look smart and intelligent. India sanctions is the start. Is the start bombing Baku moment.
Yeah. Yeah, start bombing Baku moment. I think, does that refer to the event?
Is the strat bombing Baku moment?
I'm not sure I understand
that, but
yeah.
The first part I understand. That they're making people like Chamberlain look smart.
Yeah, I mean, there was a campaign in 1939 during the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939, what's sometimes referred to as the Winter War, which there was a campaign in Britain and France to bomb Baku, which is, of course, in the capital of Azerbaijan, but it was in those days part of the Soviet Union, and it was the Soviet Union's major oil-producing area. So the British and the French, incredibly, being already at war with Germany, were floating all kinds of extraordinary plans to come to Finland's help. And one of those was to bomb Baku. And the historian A.J.P. Taylor, whom I used to know, I mean, not personally, but I used to attend lectures of his. I remember him saying that was the single most dangerous moment for the British and the French in the second, for the Allies in the Second World War, because if they'd done that crazy thing of bombing Baku, then we would have been at war simultaneously with the Soviet Union and Germany, which just doesn't even begin to bear thinking about. So I presume that's what this refers to. And it is indeed the case that if you go back and read the media articles, the British newspapers of that period, and you also read the memoirs of people like Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to London, and all these British memoirists of that time, that the hysteria over the Soviet war with Finland in 1939 was incredible. It was even worse in some ways than what happened.
I didn't see that we lost Coach.
Yes, we did lose Coach. I sent you a message. I sent you a message about it.
But sorry, Gonzalo.
Don't worry about it.
I don't have that window open, so I couldn't see.
Don't worry about it.
But as I say, it even exceeded in some ways. The anger at the time in the West even exceeded that over Germany's attack on Poland. So maybe that's the comparison that's being made here. I'm not absolutely sure, but
yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Kurt says, agree that our politicians will not admit mistakes.
No,
but they are good at blaming other politicians. Thus, a rollback can only happen with new politicians.
Yeah, we would need a complete change in our political class in the West. And in the West, I'm afraid, the one thing the political class is extremely good at is clinging on. It is extremely successful at isolating and marginalizing all critics and dissenters.
I think that the Trump administration had Trump actually not desired to be liked by this political class, but had actually tried to revamp and refresh the political class, there might have been some hope. But I think that moment is gone. And I think especially the political leadership class in the West, they will never allow another Brexit moment. They will never allow another Trump-type candidate to take over. And so the possibilities of real renewal are gone. That's my thinking at this point. And I think that they are going to carry out some sort of legalistic arrangement whereby they prevent any kind of refresh or revamp of the current leadership class. I think that that's what they're going to do.
I entirely agree. I completely agree.
And they've said as much. And Gonzalo, they've admitted it, that they'll never allow a Trump or Brexit moment to happen again.
Yeah.
They've been open about it, Naz says, happy to say I can see RT videos, and I'm in the USA.
Oh, right. Okay. Gosh.
Graham, thank you for super chat. Attila, thank you for that super sticker. Sparky said, Gonzalo's old academia. They're bird brains now.
Yes.
Referring to the entertainment industry, I guess. Yeah.
No, it's the quality of people at the elite level has so deteriorated. Uh, um, I remember the Time magazine writer William A. Henry wrote a book called In Defense of Elitism. This book came out in the early 90s. I remember reading it, and I completely agreed because I have no bones to say it. I'm a snob. I like to surround myself with intelligent, capable people of industry and intellect. But the current crop of elites are just so pathetic. They're so incompetent and so cautious and compliant. It's just so depressing. They are not a leadership class that you would follow even to the corner drugstore. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
I
And
agree.
Sparky says academia now rewards rot memory, not reason. Very true. Hammer says, will the Azov threaten Zelensky not to deal with Russia?
Oh, yes. I think that's exactly the problem that we're facing. That I think that these thugs of the Azov battalion and other such groups within the Zelensky regime, they realize that Russia has their number, and that Putin has said so himself, the denazification element. And people consistently seem to think that Putin is like a politician who will just say random words that are disconnected from reality. But no, Putin is very clear. He wants to denazify Ukraine, i.e., he wants to get rid of all these neo-Nazis, the Azov battalion and the other battalions, and all these crazy people. And he knows who they are. He said so, and he is targeting them. And so that's why the Zelensky regime will not do any kind of serious negotiation, because the people now who are in control of the Zelensky regime is not Zelensky or even Kolomoisky, the original bankroller of this whole operation, but rather these neo-Nazi thugs who have been kidnapping people, torturing people, murdering people. They came for me last Wednesday, man. I know what I'm talking about. And these people, they know that they have to hang on to power no matter what, because if the Russians take over, they are dead men. And I think that they are perfectly aware of that, and that's why they are desperate, and they will do any kind of false flag. And that is why I'm so afraid for this moment, that they will do some horrible false flag that will, apart from injuring and killing innocent Ukrainian civilians, will draw in the West into this conflict and escalate it and blow it up. It's because of these criminals. And that's why this war has to be over as quickly as possible, so we can expunge these criminals and give them their just reward. That's my thinking.
Yeah.
All right. Moon Dragon says, immigration crisis, prices and war seem the EU will pay a heavy price for NATO expansion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see. Ansem Kurt says, will Russia with China lead to a new bloc and build up Asia, Africa, South and Central America, and the Middle East, which were hurt for hundreds of years by the West?
That bloc is being constructed, and I gather that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, made a statement yesterday about how Chinese-Russian friendship is eternal or something like that. So that's of course, those are the two core countries in this bloc, which I remember reading the Chinese media saying some months ago was far more powerful than the Warsaw Pact ever was, which of course it is.
Sparky says globalists' greed is exceeded only by their vanity. Well said, Sparky. Rocky Luck says, what is Gonzalo's position on MH17? Soviet archives showed that the missile was shot down. That the missile that shot down MH17 was delivered to Soviet 223rd Air Base Defense Missile Brigade, Ternopil region, Ukraine, in 1986.
Quite frankly, I don't know enough to be able to give an intelligent opinion. So for me to say anything as regards to that it's a tragedy, of course. The loss of innocent life is a tragedy in any circumstance. But who is responsible for it? I'm not one to make that judgment. I don't frankly know. And I have not looked into it enough to be able to, like I said, not looked into it enough to give an intelligent opinion.
All right. Freedom Autopsy Report says, can anyone agree on a definition of Ukraine? What is Ukraine?
What is Ukraine? It is a region whose boundaries have changed at various times. It is a place where a language, which is Ukrainian, which is a language. I mean, it's not a dialect of Russian, as I heard some people say. It is a real language where there are many people who speak that particular language. There's a culture. What it has never really, it seems to me, coalesced into is a properly functioning polity, a state. It's never really gelled in that kind of way. Perhaps if it had been left alone, it might have done, but it wasn't.
Interesting. Russell Hall says that trading with gold, the value of gold would need to be adjusted if they were going to accept payments in gold.
It would. Well, I mean, again, I think for all the reasons Gonzalo said, even if it was adjusted, it would be impossible essentially to do. I was reading a long discussion about the operation of the old gold standard by Michael Hudson, the economist, and he pointed out that, you know, this pre-World War I golden era of the gold standard, there were already problems with it that were starting to get worse, and the countries that operated it most rigidly were actually having problems with their growth rates and their economic development because it was proving so restrictive. So I think we need to be. I don't really see gold as the option, frankly. I never have done. It's an important store of value. It has its place, but it's not what you can build the world financial system on.
No, I agree.
All right. Divine Insurgent says you're talking about physical asset classes. Luxury watches are an obscure and thus an underrated asset class. Rolex, Patek Philippe have exploded.
Oh, absolutely. And if you, I know quite a lot about this because, you know, in London, we have a very, very big market, by the way, in luxury watches and in secondhand luxury watches. And of course, if you know anything, they are, you know how that market works. You know that they are an important store of value, which people cash in on at particular times. But you also have to know the right people to trade in them, because if you go to a normal jeweler with your Rolex, you get about 1/30th of its price. So I mean, it's a difficult market, but it certainly does exist.
Flying Boar says, you think India will get involved in the Ukraine cause of Indian students? Will India call out Ukraine's Azov battalions? We talked about this.
I have done. I gather there's been a lot about this in India as well. But again, I don't follow the Indian media as closely as I do, say, the Chinese. But I gather that this has been much talked about in India itself.
Yeah. FL64, thank you for the super sticker. JW Moore, thank you for that super chat. And Cactus Ray said, will the Biden administration be able to resist increasing pressure to sanction all oil and gas exports from Russia?
Well, I have great skepticism about this. And I think when you're talking about the Biden administration, it's quite clear to me that there's some people who are demented enough to do it and to want to do it. And that's the truth. So, you know, it's not just the external pressure, there's internal pressure as well. And you have an empty suit in the Oval Office. Only, of course, he isn't most of the time even in the Oval Office, but in its replica somewhere. And, you know, he's quite likely to sign whatever's put in front of him. So, you know, it's not a good situation.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, he's in the sound stage across the street. Yeah, Sparky says, didn't Russia and China set up a gold-backed large transaction system between each other? If so, maybe not a big factor, but a factor nonetheless.
I don't know about this, but of course they've set up many systems and they're going to be enhanced. I mean, one of the things I'm hearing that Russian banks are doing at incredible speed, this is clearly being prepared, is that after Visa and MasterCard acted. By the way, I should like to clarify this. If you live in Russia and you have a Visa or MasterCard issued by a Russian bank, it still works in Russia. Yeah. It doesn't work if you take it out of Russia, and a Visa or MasterCard issued outside Russia will not work in Russia. But a Russian Visa or MasterCard issued by a Russian bank in Russia will still work in Russia. But regardless of that, apparently the Russian banks are now storming out to connect all their various cards to Union Pay, which is the Chinese system, which if you go to the Far East, which I have done, you see it everywhere. It is at least as widespread. In fact, it's probably more widespread than Visa and MasterCard are there.
Yeah, my thinking on that card situation, for instance, again, it only hurt the West. It only isolated the West from the future, which is China, Russia. And parenthetically to that, or as an aside to that, or corollary to that, this absurd notion in the West, in Europe, and especially in the United States, that one day Russia and China are going to go to war. One day, they're going to have a falling out. That this partnership is just transitory. That's just coping. That's just fooling yourself. If Russia and China ever have a falling out, we're talking decades from now, because the integration that they've carried out over the last few years is so profound, and the trust that they've developed in one another on a governmental level and a financial level is so profound and so deep rooted, even after just a couple of decades, that the notion that they're all of a sudden going to tear apart this very fruitful relationship between the two, it's just fooling yourself. I mean, why would you do that? Why would you tell yourself fantasy stories instead of looking the truth in the face? It's like saying that the British and the Americans are all of a sudden going to go to war over, I don't know, Iceland or something stupid like that. I mean, come on, grow up.
Exactly.
True. It's true. And you know what? If people were hearing this, Gonzalo, people were hearing this live stream, a lot of people that have actually bought into the whole China's going to one day invade Russia, or Russia's a gas station masquerading as a country, or their GDP is the size of Idaho or whatever, they'd be listening to the stream saying that we're absolutely crazy.
But that's the problem that's happened with it's not just the elites, it's the educational establishment itself. It's bought into the notion that bullshit is reality. Please excuse my foul language, but you two are the gentlemen here, and I'm the rube and the the vulgarian. They believe all this bullshit. They think that if they just manufacture some random tweet, it becomes magically reality, and that's not the case. Come on.
Yeah. Thank you, Frank, for that super sticker, and thank you, FLA64, for that super sticker, FL64. And Freedom Autopsy Report says India has emerged as a voice in the Anglosphere, long overdue. I agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been the making of India as a major diplomatic
That's
force.
a big story.
It's a very big story. I was reading in the Telegraph an article by an absolutely ludicrous, I mean, in some ways he's a ludicrous figure, at least, sorry to say that. He's called Con Coughlin. He's a writer who writes the Telegraph, and it is widely known. This is not, I'm not giving away anything, that he has connections with the intelligence world in Britain. But he was absolutely shocked and very dismayed at the attitude that India has taken in during this crisis. And that shows that India is asserting itself as a coming great power.
Yeah. Khalil says, if you want to make a bet on the best city to live in for the next 3 to 10 years that you think has a chance to avoid the upcoming turbulence and can be considered as an emerging hub on several fronts, which would it be?
Budapest.
Yeah. That's an interesting choice. I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't been there. So, yeah, I've never been to Budapest.
Oh, so no, you're missing out.
I've heard. A lot of people have told me it's an amazing place. Actually, yes. I would be. Yeah, the only thing I would say is that obviously we're talking on the assumption that the government that rules the place remains, and we will only know that on the 1st of April. Is it with the election?
I think 4th of April.
Well, the fact that the leadership of Hungary is in general realistic about the situation, as you yourself said, that the opposition is more or less on track with the current government as to how to deal with Ukraine and Russia. That leads me to conclude that they're going to realize that they are a small but potentially powerful country like Switzerland. And if they play their cards right, they can become a major force into the future. And so I think that might happen. I have to tell you, I loved Budapest. I highly recommend it. Yes.
Right. Yeah, it is a beautiful city. Yeah. Jay says, are you gentlemen familiar with Dugin's fourth political theory and what influence Dugin might be having? We get this every
all the time. I read it. Yes. I was sent a copy of it by the man who translated it into English, and he wanted me to write a review. And I started writing review, and then I thought better of it and let it go. Can I just say straight away, Dugin is somebody who is, reasonably well known in Russia. He's the kind of person who crops up on Russian talk shows. He has no political influence at all. Some of the things he said in that book were extraordinarily insightful. Others I thought were completely wrong. And the fact is, it talked about a fourth political theory. And I remember reading the book, waiting to see what it would be. And it never emerged. I never got any idea of what he was going, where it was going. I mean, as far as I could tell, it was sort of bits and bobs of other theories that he wanted to sort of cobble together into something different. But it never really cohered into anything. And ultimately, it was incredibly clever in places and very insightful, but in the end, disappointing.
That reminds me. I haven't read Dugin, but it reminds me a little bit of Ted Kaczynski, whom I did read, and I read quite carefully. And it's sort of like, yes, a lot of very interesting points, a lot of very good insights, but in general, it doesn't gel. It doesn't come together. As a political theory, and to say that there is a political theory, it's sort of like, no, there isn't. There are just a few insights that are cool, but nothing to say. The only difference, of course, is that Ted Kaczynski is a cold-blooded murderer, and Dugin is just some random rambling Russian.
Yeah. Edgardus, thank you for your super sticker. And J.W. Moore says, Alexander, what recording of Tristan do you recommend?
I still like the Furtwängler version with Ludwig Suthaus and Kerstin Flagstadt from the early 1950s, 1952. Of course, it's mono, but I still think, the advantage of having Furtwängler conducted is extraordinary. But if you want to get an even more remarkable Tristan, which is there's a live recording from, I think, Covent Garden with Melchior and Flagstadt from the 30s. Now, the orchestra sound isn't perhaps the best, and of course everything is very distorted, but it is in terms of its singing, it's just out of this world. If you want a good stereo version, I would go for the one by Karl Böhm, which is on Deutsche Grammophon, which is from the early 60s.
I know we're winding down, but there was a question in the chat. It was not a super chat, but I wanted to bring it up because it's something worth bringing up. And I know we're winding down the show, and I don't want to overextend it. It was relevant. Blinken recently said that he was giving, quote, the green light, end quote, for NATO countries to start moving aircraft to Ukraine. What do you gentlemen think of that green light, quote unquote?
Well, it tells you two things. Firstly, it tells you three things. Firstly, it tells you that Blinken is an extreme hardliner. Third, it tells you that he's completely out of touch with reality, is an extremely dangerous and utterly crazy man. And third is that he's trying to push the window all the time on ever more dangerous escalations with the Russians. Just as yesterday, he was the person who was floating the idea of an oil embargo on Russia after Nancy Pelosi was pushing it. So I think it shows you that Blinken is completely reckless and irresponsible and dangerous. But as you absolutely rightly said, Gonzalo, shortly after, the Poles themselves came out and rejected it. And I gather they've been saying more things over the course of the day, basically shooting that whole idea down, just as the Germans have been shooting the whole idea of the oil embargo down. The difference is, I think the Polish position will stick because I think the Poles have the Pentagon on side. But with the oil embargo idea, I think that Blinken might very well succeed in getting what he wants.
All right. Hermes says RT is good online in Australia. So RT is online in Australia.
Interesting. Okay.
John says, it seems that the EU governments are fighting against reality. In geography, men flow in the path of least resistance. It makes more sense to get resources from your neighbor than halfway across the world. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well said. Jim, thank you for that awesome super sticker. Thank you for that. Six Turning says, based on what I've seen of Russian advance, it looks like they want to use the Dnieper as a natural defense border should Ukraine be broken up.
Well, I am not a military person. I think the person who's responded to that already is Gonzalo, and he takes a different view. He thinks they're going to go all the way to Lviv, and so does Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter, by the way, argued. We spoke quite recently, and he was absolutely. I should have said this before, by the way. He was absolutely clear that he thinks they will go all the way to Lviv.
It would be wonderful to do a show with Scott Ritter.
I'm going to try and arrange it. I'm going to try and arrange
That'd
it.
be great.
I can't promise it. I cannot.
No, certainly not. But it
Yeah.
would be wonderful. And if you have an extra chair, please, I'd love to, if only to listen.
No,
in,
please.
he's someone
I
I'm
think
interested in listening to.
I think he'd be delighted to speak with you, Gonzalo.
Yeah.
But I will try and arrange it. Obviously, I can't commit him to
Sure.
anything, and he's very much in demand at the moment. But absolutely.
Brotherman says Ukraine is dragging other countries into its regional war is something that will make the world pay a heavy price one way or another sooner or later.
I have to say that I agree with that. And I also have to say that seems to me, as far as I can tell, to be the Ukrainian battle strategy. To the extent that they have one, it's to try to involve other countries in the war that's going on in Ukraine.
It's without a doubt the strategy, to drag it out and to get others involved,
Yeah.
Ralph Pedersen says, I'm not employing a VPN or others getting around the block methods just given as an explanation. Yes, so RT. Once again, accessing RT. Thank you very much for that. And Laurie says, oil produced in the U.S. is sold to the highest bidder on the international market, not sold domestically for energy independence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's totally right. And of course, it would require a completely different economic system in the United States to actually control where oil goes. And other countries have got that kind of economic system, but the whole strength of the American economic system has historically been based on free enterprise. So you're going to start interfering with it on that level, then you're changing an awful lot about the way the United States has historically operated.
Sidebook VR says the only way to reform the U.S. is to purge millions off the power chessboard, but this is impossible following proper democratic rules. Weakness of democracies.
Well, I can understand the point. I still, maybe I'm being sentimental, but I still believe that the US, if any Western country is going to break away from this, it will be the US. The very fact that you can see RT there in some places, you can't see it anywhere here in Europe.
Yeah. Tristan said, gents, the ruble just went into hyperinflation at 175. Is that true? 175.
I haven't seen.
Wow.
I haven't seen.
If it crashes right now, it doesn't mean anything long term. Talk to me after 60 days, 120 days. But if it's just a momentary crash, it doesn't mean much. And especially not when people start to realize what's what insofar as the commodities markets are concerned.
I completely agree. I don't think the Russians don't seem to be very stressed about this at all.
Well, no, because the Russians realize that this Ukrainian thing is an existential crisis. So exactly. their currency, it doesn't really matter. It's like worrying about the paint on your car when your house is on fire.
Exactly.
Yeah. Stanislav says, check out the predictions of Vanga, who Putin met personally.
Who's he?
Well, I think she's a Bulgarian, psychic mystic.
Oh, I'm into all that crazy stuff.
I believe, yeah.
I think it's very amusing, so I'm going to check it out. Vanga.
Check it out. Vanga, Vanga, Vanga. Thank you very much for that, Stanislav. Radovid said, Croatian volunteers took part at the Battle of Stalingrad. It is not forgotten.
No.
Thank you very much for that. And let's see here.
Because I make all of my major decisions based on the stars and what my local astrologist says. So I have to read up on Vanga.
Let's see. Heyman says, Russia without economic links to the West is actually harder to deal with. By demonizing and turning Putin into Attila, we give China space to be China.
No.
Interesting observation. James says, will this be a new scramble for Africa for North Americans and Europeans?
I think we talked about that. I think we talked about
that as well. Yeah. We talked about that as well. How should Iran and Venezuela approach the USA now that the USA needs them?
Get as much as they can short term.
Yeah.
RT Sputnik is gone, so RT will go soon. That's what Iris says. It's all part of the same media group. So Redline says Macron and Schultz say they don't see neo-Nazis in Ukraine or killing of civilians in Donbass. Do they believe it? Looks like they're under a spell of their own propaganda.
Yeah. I'm sure they know it's going on. I don't believe that they don't see it. And that begs lots of questions about these people.
Stefan says, as a first-generation German immigrant to the States, I felt being betrayed because all the sanctions imposed, they're against Western values taught in my university.
Oh, there you go.
Very true. And Raphael says, in 2 weeks, people in Europe and the USA will be rioting against high prices. We are dealing with emotional citizens who only care about stuff. It's not smart. It's going to be interesting to see if people get onto the streets. I agree. Let's see. Life of Brian says, can you elaborate on the Western ruling class entrenching itself and anything that could be done to resist? Not ready to give up hope.
Right. I'm not ready to give up hope, but I want to stress this is a huge topic. And I think if we get drawn into that now and talking about how the Western elite entrenches itself, that's another 3-hour program, actually.
Yeah. No Sense says Moldova remains the only non-NATO state between NATO and the Russian sphere, only route to fuel turmoil in Ukraine without NATO direct involvement.
Yeah.
A lot of people talking about Moldova and Romania. Interesting.
Also, we shouldn't forget Finland. Finland is making stupid moves. That'll be on the front burner soon enough.
Yeah. NATO, everybody. Creators, freedom. What business does the American government have with Iran after what they did to Soleimani?
Good question.
I don't think the Iranians forgot.
I'm sure they haven't forgotten.
Yeah. Raphael says, I'm going to say it. A big part of the Republicans wants the U.S. to split. No one is mentioning it. USA is not whole now. The USA has internal issues.
Yeah.
And let's see. Raul says, read the book Catholic Prophecies by Yves Dupont. It is in line with all discussions out here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Raul, for that. And Raphael says, guys, I'm watching RBC, a Russian TV station. They show a ribbon for financial stuff. Everything is stable. Programming is normal. Russia is okay.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, I just looked up on the ruble. This is thin, very thin overseas trades. It doesn't really, it didn't fall to 175 either. But I mean, it's not, there hasn't been quite the crash, I think, that people expected. And this is a very little impact on Russia itself.
All right. Sparky says, Nixon, China, Russia's triangulations out the window. Good point.
Good point.
And Elena says, if the petrodollar ends, do you think the Union of States of America can survive? Can it happen can it disintegrate like the Soviet Union? If not, why? If yes, why?
I hope it doesn't. I still hope it doesn't. And I still hope the US pulls through, and I believe it will.
Merch says, after all this is done,
I don't think the US doesn't need the petrodollar. I think the petrodollar has been a problem, not a strength, actually.
Merch says, after all this is done, what's the makeup of Eastern Europe? Poland and Hungary are on the outs with the EU. Could they leave but not join Russia?
Well, like I said, to pick up what I said before, the central issue of the European Union is Germany, France. Yeah. If the economic issues that are clearly going to be coming up over the next, between 6 and 30 months, shatter the relationship between Germany and France, then of course all the other peripheral countries of the European Union will slink off and do their own thing.
Heyman says if they cared about the Ukraine, they'd invite it into the EU, not NATO.
If they cared about Ukraine,
they cared,
be neutral.
If they cared,
neutral,
exactly.
and turn it into Austria. Basically.
Even to this day, they do not state that Ukraine will be neutral. Even to this day, they refuse to do it.
I know.
They'll accept all the other conditions, recognize Crimea, recognize the Donbass, but for some weird, bizarre reason, Ukraine being neutral, they won't budge. Damas says, please elaborate on the political and military and other consequences of this war on Syria.
Gosh, elaborate. I think that it's going to take the attention away from Syria for a while, which is good for Syria. I think the Russians will remain fully entrenched in Syria. And of course, the Russian defense minister, Shoigu, was there a short time ago.
All right. And the final question, this is a good one. Do you think Westerners will still be able to travel to this new bloc? Will it be like Warsaw Pact at all when it comes to restrictions? Gonzalo and then Alexander, are we going to be able to travel to this new world?
I hope so.
Actually, I think not.
Yeah.
Well, I hope. Okay. Okay, let's go with I think not first. I think not first.
I think and Alexander, you tell me what you think of this analysis. I think that the damage of these sanctions will prove to be psychologically so severe on both sides that the countries that engage in these sanctionings of Russia will be personas non grata in Russia. And the Chinese will just sort of like follow along because they do want to keep in the good graces of Russia. And the only people who will be able to sort of like hop between the two blocks will be of those essentially non-aligned nations. The nations that sort of like shied away from the whole issue. Like, as for instance, myself as a Chilean, we in Chile are just marginalizing ourselves from this whole issue. We in Chile have long-standing ties with Russia. Because of the communists in Chile during the 60s and 70s and 50s formed very strong relationships with the Soviet Union back in the day. And today, as a Chilean citizen, I can go into Russia without a visa and stay 90 days out of any 180-day period. It's a very generous situation in that regard. And I think that countries like Chile in that regard that are able to be friends with both sides, because as a Chilean citizen, I can do the exact same thing in the United States. These very few countries that are non-aligned in this way and are basically friendly with both sides will be able to travel between the two. But I think that American citizens will not be allowed to travel into Russia, and Russian citizens will not be allowed to travel into the European Union or the United States. That's my thinking at this time. What do you gentlemen think?
I'm not going to make a prediction because I don't know. I mean, I have valued very much my ability to travel to these countries. And obviously, I've established connections with people who live in Russia. And I'd be very, very sorry if we're cut off from each other again. So when I said at the start, I hope not. But the reality is that it may turn out exactly, Gonzalo, as you say. So I think we're just too early at this stage to be able to say this for certain one way or the other.
Yeah, I agree with you, Gonzalo. I think the only thing that will open up Russia to Europe, I don't know about the US, but to Europe and vice versa, is if Europe gets new leadership, breaks apart, somehow gets new leadership in Brussels, which each new commissioner and each new person in Brussels gets worse by the year, so they all just get worse. Or if the pain is just too damn much for the European Union, and they say, you know what, we give in. I don't see that happening. So
Pride, hubris.
Yeah.
You know, you Greek gentlemen or gentlemen of Greek descent, you know all about that emotion. You invented it. Your people invented the concept, and I think that is very tragic in the situation.
I agree. One final question. It is the federalism comment. It is the federalism that the U.S. has that allows for hope that we may one day escape the globalists. And James says, any thoughts of having James Rickards as a future guest? He's the author of The Currency Wars. Where does the American investor go from here?
Well,
that would be cool to have Rickards.
It would be cool. We could.
Yeah, we're open.
Cool. It would be
we're
cool.
open.
Absolutely, we're open.
Where does an American investor go from here? Real quick, Gonzalo. Real quick, what does an American investor go?
Man,
Because I say that because you mentioned it in your stream that you did yesterday a little bit. You touched upon
I have
it.
a friend of mine,
Like,
a friend of mine out in New England. I won't mention where. He recently, he's about to get married. He's a man in his mid-30s, very successful in a white collar occupation, extremely successful, frankly. And I mean, a one percenter, if you could put it that way. And he recently purchased his first home for his new bride, and he locked in a fixed mortgage at 3.5%. 30 years, and for a very, very beautiful house, very large, and the kind of family home that you would have, that such a man would have for a potentially large family. He's Catholic, and I was telling him, you are the luckiest man on the face of the planet, because if there is inflation coming your way, you with this fixed mortgage rate at 3.5%, which he locked in literally a month ago, all of a sudden, as inflation rises, but his own salary, because of his position, will continue to rise, his own income will continue to rise, his debt will become nothing. It will just evaporate. And just as, for instance, somebody who had a mortgage, they took out a mortgage in 1965, and they were paying, $130 a month in their mortgage for their, 200 square meter home. It faded into nothing because of inflation. Inflation is the best friend of those who are in debt. And so on the one hand, those people who are, for instance, those who have student debts, they're going to be doing very, very well in an inflationary environment, because their student debts will decrease relative to their income, assuming, of course, they are able to maintain the relative purchasing power of their income, i.e., their employer keeps increasing their wages. Let's assume that it's some sort of white collar or some sort of business that requires it. But the point is, the debtors are going to be great, because their payments are going to be minimized. But it's the people who have currency. They're the people who are going to suffer. And the people who lose their jobs, they are going to suffer. It's going to be a disaster for everybody else, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well said. Raphael says there's a reason why Russia is doing this alone. And Kickjack says, just another chat to Palan to keep you guys here. Hello, thank you very much. And Sparky says, eventually Westerners will learn to fashion balloons from vinyl parkers to escape to the east. Thank you very much for that, Sparky. All right. Thank you to all our moderators, to Valley S, Spartan Warrior Queen, Reckless Abandon, Alan Watson, GEC812, Cosmic Rain, Zariel. Who else? I think I got everybody that was moderating. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you to all the chats, to Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute, to our awesome locals community. Thank you to the locals community. We really, really appreciate you guys. And final thoughts, Alexander and Gonzalo Lira and everybody. Please subscribe to Gonzalo Lira's YouTube channel, his new YouTube channel. The link is in the description box down below. And Gonzalo, if you also may want to maybe introduce or to the viewers to your channel and what it's going to be about as well. The floor
it's
is
going to
yours.
be more about the current situation that's going on, and then I'll transition and probably try to be one of your competitors, but in the most friendly way imaginable. And before I go and before we close out, this has been a very long program, but I want to tell you how much I appreciate your invitation. Thank you so much for having me on. I hope I've been able to contribute to the level of discourse, because you gentlemen, it's always a pleasure as always. And to tell you the truth, on a personal level, it really has cheered me up to be able to talk to you about these things, because I'm underground here in Kharkov because of my current complicated circumstances. And it's incredibly stressful, and yet at the same time, incredibly boring, because there's nothing else to think about except my current predicament. And so to be here, to be talking to you gentlemen, it's such a relief and such a pleasure, and it's just so relaxing. So I just want to thank you, because for me, this has been my day's entertainment. So thank you so, so very much. And chat, thank you all for your patience. And I hope that you learned something and you expanded your horizons a little bit.
Gonzalo, it is a huge pleasure for us to have you on our program. And I think we have to say that we feel privileged that you join us and contribute in the way that you do. Your contributions are magnificent and wonderful and even invaluable.
And Gonzalo, I see many people writing in the chat. I'm sure you see it as well. They're saying subbed. So that's really, really good.
Thank you. Thank you, chat. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Raphael, for that final super sticker. I think that's everything. Do you guys have any final words, any final thoughts? It's been a very, very long but incredible live stream.
Yeah.
But any final thoughts?
Venga. We have to do a program on Venga. We have to look at her predictions and consider them like Nostradamus' words, for crying out loud. In her words are our future destinies, gentlemen. There we will see our future.
Agreed.
Right. Agreed. Thank you, ATN, for those final super chats as well. All right, everybody, we'll sign off, and we'll catch you guys tomorrow, day after. We'll see.
Tomorrow. We'll see.
We'll see. No, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.